Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the Future of Speech Online 2025, the age of constitutional evasion, jawboning, and other forms of government pressure to control private speech. I'm Kate Rawan, the director of CDT's Free Expression Project, and we're excited you could join us today. Just as a heads up, we are recording and live streaming today's session on CDT's YouTube page. So if you have to pop out to another meeting, that's okay. You can catch what you missed online. Please also note that this event is on the record. We're scheduled to go from noon until 3 p.m. Eastern today, and our speaker schedules are tight, so we're going to do our best to stick to that schedule. If you have questions, get them in early, which brings me to, we're taking audience questions throughout the session. If you're connecting through the Zoom webinar, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the window. If you're following on the live stream, you can submit questions via email at questions@cdt.org or via X or Blue Sky using hashtag CDT questions, hashtag FOSO2025, and @SendDemTech. CDT's communications team will be monitoring these channels, and we will pass those questions to our panelists. We are delighted to welcome a very broad audience today, and we would remind all speakers and participants to try and keep our language as accessible and understandable as possible to allow non-experts to follow along more easily. I would now like to turn it over to Casey Maddox, Vice President of Legal Strategy at Stand Together Trust, for welcoming remarks.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to day 2 of the Future of Speech Online. Thank you, Kate, and all of our friends at the Center for Democracy and Technology, our panelists, and all of you for joining us online. Elizabeth Willing Powell is a name that you probably don't know. She was a Philadelphia woman whose home had been taken over by British troops during the Revolution. She corresponded regularly with George Washington and many of the other founders. Far from being a random woman, as the story is that I will relate is often told, she was privy to many of the conversations of the founders as they debated our Constitution. And on September 17, 1787, 81-year-old Ben Franklin walked out of the Constitutional Convention, where she asked the question that she is most known for: what do we have, sir, a republic or a monarchy? And Franklin, of course, famously responded, a republic if you can keep it. Now, what does it mean to keep our republic, and how are we to keep it? We are free speech fans here, and we wouldn't have much of a republic without free speech. But Ben Franklin wasn't thinking about the First Amendment specifically when he said this, of course, because the First Amendment didn't exist. Instead, what Ben Franklin was talking about was something much more basic: the very structure of our Constitution, the articles up top that had just been approved by the Constitutional Convention. This was the way to make Republican self-government work, and it ensured that America would not become yet another despotic monarchy. But it's also not entirely wrong to connect keeping the Republic and keeping our rights, especially First Amendment rights, because the Republic was designed in the Constitution and created for a specific purpose, identified in the Declaration of Independence, and we all know this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Franklin's Republic was defined by those simple articles that precede the Bill of Rights: enumerated powers, reserved powers to the states, checks and balances. Those were the means of securing our rights and keeping our republic. Fast forward a couple hundred years. Justice Scalia was asked by a TV interviewer to respond to Justice Ginsburg, his friend Justice Ginsburg's claim that the Bill of Rights is the preeminent guarantee of the people's rights in all of the world. This was his response: the foundation of our freedom is not based in the Bill of Rights. That was an afterthought. Every tin-pot dictator has a Bill of Rights, which he casually ignores. What was debated in 1787 and what ensures our freedom is our structure of government, which holds each branch to account. Have no illusions, structure dictates destiny. America, of course, is not unique for having a First Amendment or its equivalent. The Germans, the French, all of Europe actually, all say that they protect free speech. The Soviet Union had a First Amendment. And in North Korea, under Article 67 of its constitution, I will quote, "Citizens are guaranteed freedom of speech, of the press, of assembly, demonstration, and association." Even the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, of course, says everyone has a right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas, through any media and regardless of frontiers. China and Iran are signatories to that, as well, of course, as the United Kingdom these days. But those rights are worth the structure of government behind them, no more and no less. And that's because defending free speech has always been and always will be weird. Free speech has been called the eternally radical idea because throughout human history, it's always been the crazy radicals, people like the people who would spend their afternoon joining us today, who really wanted to defend it. There's nothing at all inevitable about people in power wanting to preserve the freedom for others to speak out in opposition to their continued power. So far, much of our conversation on day one has been about the First Amendment and Section 230, and rightly so. Those are critical to the future of speech online. But if the consolidation of government power is necessarily a threat to free speech, then free speech advocates have to be concerned not just with fighting rearguard actions against free speech violations when they occur. We have to be concerned about the accumulation of government power, especially in the executive branch. Think about what we learned in Murphy versus Missouri. Despite the decision on standing, we are left with the documented knowledge that a variety of federal officials coerced social media platforms to censor user speech. Scores of emails from administration officials, none of whom having titles or job descriptions with anything to do with social media content, overtly or subtly threatening tech companies with repercussions if they did not censor or alter content in the way that they wanted. And I say coercing because the emails also showed that the platforms were frequently pushing back against the bureaucrats' demands. If Meta or X had sued, they would have had a strong case. But of course, those companies were unlikely to sue the federal regulators who controlled the tools of regulatory pressure and government largesse. And of course, this will often be the problem. The facts in Murphy and Vullo are somewhat unique in that the threats and pressure and inducements were foolishly put in writing. But as the size and scope of the federal executive branch expands and its ability to reward friends and punish enemies grows, we should not expect that its coercive power will always be so manifest. It won't have to be. During the Murphy case, I spoke to law school student groups about the potential for federal officials to make asks of media companies with mergers pending before the FTC and the FCC, or before the FTC and DOJ, small asks, even ones that the company was already considering and might just need some encouragement on from their friends in the federal government. Just imagine such a thing. The federal executive branch now employs over 2.1 million people. That's not even including military, the Postal Service, just the federal executive branch as you probably normally think about it. The Article 1 branch, Congress, employs 10,000. They control hundreds of billions of dollars in grants and have immense procurement power. They also have the power to investigate, regulate, and otherwise either make a private business's life miserable or to make their competitors' lives miserable. And they have too often assumed for themselves the power to be the change they want to see in the world. This kind of power exercised by people no one elected is not what it looks like, in my view, to keep a Republican form of government. It looks far more like the form of government that Mrs. Powell feared America might become. Without the system of limited government and the checks and balances the founders created to protect them, Americans' First Amendment rights may become the same parchment guarantee that others have had throughout history and today. This afternoon, you'll hear from panelists discussing the potential threats to free speech posed by FCC and FTC pressures brought to bear on platforms' editorial discretion. You'll hear from those who've worked with speakers and journalists pressured by government to change their speech, and how US and foreign governments monitor social media and chill speech. My own view is that we can't win these fights with the First Amendment or even Section 230 alone. And the founders didn't expect us to. Thomas Jefferson said that the natural progress of things is for liberty to yield and government to gain ground. To secure the future of speech online, we must not only be First Amendment advocates, but also vigilant defenders of the structure of liberty in our Constitution that's necessary for securing those rights and ensuring that liberty need not yield. Thanks again to our friends at CDT and others for joining us today. I am looking forward to this afternoon's discussions.
Thank you so much, Casey. And thanks again to Stand Together Trust for your support of FOSO. So our first panel today is about jawboning by federal agencies, specifically the Federal Communications Commission and the Federal Trade Commission. I am going to have the privilege of being the moderator of this one, so let's get started. To delve more deeply into questions around the FTC and FCC, what their authority is, what it isn't, and the dangers they currently pose to free expression, I'm joined by a truly expert panel. I'll introduce them briefly, but you can and should access their entire impressive biographies online. So now I'd like to welcome Chris Lewis, the President and CEO of Public Knowledge, Caitlin Bogus, Senior Advisor for Advocacy at the Freedom of the Press Foundation, Baron Soka, President and Co-founder of Tech Freedom, and Danny Venick from the Office of Senator Markey. Danny is actually going to be a little bit late because he is staffing Senator Markey at the Senate Commerce hearing that's happening right now, examining jawboning. At the hearing, senators discussed the ways that government pressure can inappropriately shape private speech, expressing bipartisan concerns, which is good. But the question is, what will be done about it? It's clear we have to do something. And two of the agencies of interest to those concerned about jawboning are the Federal Communications Commission and the Federal Trade Commission. Both have been very busy trying to shape the speech of private actors in ways the government would prefer. The FCC, led by its chairman, Brendan Carr, has probably given the clearest example of what we usually think of as jawboning yet, when Chair Carr threatened ABC with punishment if the network did not silence Jimmy Kimmel following remarks about the reaction to the murder of Charlie Kirk that Chairman Carr disliked. But that's not all the FCC has done. They have reopened previously dismissed complaints against broadcasters because of speech they engaged in, and done other things that I'm sure we'll discuss as well. Meanwhile, the FTC has been no slouch in the jawboning department. The agency conducted a proceeding asking social media companies, users to report circumstances in which they have been censored or shadow banned in an apparent effort to support the narrative that social media content moderation efforts are biased against conservatives. The FTC is also concerningly extracting settlements from speech intermediaries with significant implications for free expression. So let's get the conversation started. First, let's talk about the FCC for a little while. Baron, given how we've seen the FCC pressure broadcasters since January, can you walk us through the FCC's authority over broadcasters and what its public interest obligations actually are/are not?
Yeah, sure. Well, let's start by setting the table for what the First Amendment requires, because that actually helps us understand what the FCC can't do. So in Moody versus NetChoice last year, the Supreme Court said that the court had held many times in many contexts that it is no job for government to decide what counts as the right balance of expression, to unbias what it thinks is balanced, rather than to leave such judgments to speakers and their audiences. And the court also said that it's simply not the job of the government to try to rejigger the expressive realm. And yet, of course, that's what the Federal Communications Commission has tried to do for decades. And the reason is that the Communications Act, enacted back in 1934, is unclear about all of this. It gives the FCC broad discretion to determine what is in the public interest, and it creates a structure where broadcasters are licensed by the government, and that license is always at risk. I thought it was really helpful yesterday when Derek Bambauer suggested that we need to think beyond jawboning as such. Jawboning, in his definition, is when an agency or a government official does something and achieves a great result based on a weak legal authority. But as he pointed out, the Federal Communications Commission is the paradigmatic example of an agency that has so much power over the parties that it regulates that whether it has legal authority is sort of besides the point. It's in an essentially an abusive relationship, and the regulated party will do what the agency says it wants, or it will anticipate what the agency wants. So to answer your question, the agency claims, Brendan Carr has claimed, that he has broad authority to determine what is in the public interest. And he's suggested, without exactly connecting the dots in a very precise legal way, that would include being able to decide that Jimmy Kimmel had distorted the news by speaking as a comedian on broadcast channels that were owned by Disney. Now, he's doing all of that based on the public interest standard under the Communications Act. But I think the central point to make here is whatever that standard means, whatever the FCC's longstanding news distortion policy means, it can't mean what the Federal Communications Commission can't do. It can't mean trying to balance or unbias the media. Those are things that the Supreme Court has been very clear that the government cannot do in general, and that has to apply to broadcasters, whatever the longstanding authority of the FCC is to impose special regulations on broadcasters under the Supreme Court's 1969 Red Lion decision, because spectrum is scarce and they're given a monopoly right on that. That might mean other things. It might mean special rules for children, but it can't mean determining the fairness or bias or balance of media.
Thanks, Baron. Chris, I'm wondering if you have anything to add onto that, particularly around what news distortion really is, and how the distortion of news distortion might be creating confusion and additional problems here.
Sure. What I'd add is, there is power for the FCC to get into news distortion, but proving news distortion is awfully difficult. And that's for good reason, because of the First Amendment protections and the protections of the Communications Act against censorship from the Federal Communications Commission. And so proving news distortion really has a high bar traditionally. And we saw in the Biden administration under Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel, there were complaints against various broadcasters about unfavorable coverage, and she basically dismissed those as her term was ending. Then move ahead to this year, and Chairman Carr reinstated those complaints without anyone filing or asking for them to be reinstated. He simply reinstated the news distortion complaints against ABC, against NBC, against CBS, leaving out the one against Fox. You can ask him his reasons why on that. So we learned right away that this chairman at the FCC was taking a different approach to try to pressure broadcasters using the authority that Barron described. But that is a very difficult bar to meet. In fact, we believe that the matters in those cases with those broadcasters were quickly moot, because when it came to equal time, NBC was very careful to offer equal time to the Trump campaign, and the Trump campaign took them up on it. There were, I think it was the CBS complaints about the editing or editorial decisions around Vice President Harris's interviews. They asked them to make the full interview available, and they did. And so really, those news distortion cases should not have been reopened, and even when they were, they should have been dropped right away. We've seen other efforts from the FCC to try to censor or control editorial decisions by news. Barron talked about the vagaries of the public interest standard at the FCC, and there have been norms and public interest values that for generations we've tried to have the FCC protect. Things like localism, that having local content is important to serve our diverse communities. Things like having competition in the marketplace, so that one company does not control all of the media that's happening out there. So we have media ownership rules. But these public interest values are currently under threat by Chairman Carr. He is actively looking to roll back some of the media ownership rules, and he's twisted the idea of localism, I think, to beat up on some of these media companies that, yes, have local broadcasters, but those local broadcasters are often controlled and owned by large conglomerates like Sinclair and Nexstar. And so they are not really local in the way you would normally think of a local broadcaster, in the way that the Communications Act originally intended. So there's real concern about what we're seeing at the FCC, and that's simply under the authority that they currently have, that Barron described. That doesn't even get at the efforts that Chairman Carr has been clear that he wants to get at when it comes to the choices made by media companies that are online. tech platforms. He's used the bully pulpit for sure to say that he wants to find ways to reel in big tech and the choices that they make. But right now, the Communications Act does not give him the authority to do so.
Thanks, Chris. I'm cognizant of the fact that we've been talking about broadcasters themselves quite a bit, and those who own the speech distribution platforms, but the underlying speech is being conducted by journalists and those who are interested in delivering the news to people. So, Caitlin, I'd love to turn to you to talk a little bit about how this is impacting the speech of journalists and news organizations.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Thanks for having me and for hosting this conversation. I think when we're thinking about how this is impacting journalists and news organizations, it's really important to understand the breadth and persistence of Chairman Carr's campaign against broadcasters and the press. And we've already touched on a lot of the actions, the Kimmel issue and the complaints he reinstated against CBS, ABC, and NBC. But there are others too. He launched investigations into NPR and PBS advertising practices, saying they may have violated federal law by broadcasting commercial advertisements, despite the fact that the FCC doesn't directly regulate NPR and PBS. It does regulate the licensee stations, but not those entities. He also has launched investigations into Comcast, which at the time, owned NBC and MSNBC, and Disney, which owns ABC, over their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And I think really troubling, he's gone after some of the little guys too. So he opened an investigation into the California radio station KCBS after the station broadcast a report about an immigration raid that had occurred in his community. And Chairman Carr said that the investigation was based on the possibility that the station had, put ICE agents at risk by broadcasting their locations. But really, it was just doing day-to-day journalism, which is talking about police and law enforcement activity in a community. And that is clearly protected by the First Amendment. And so all of these things adding up has been a steady drumbeat that has sent a clear message to both corporate owners, but also journalists on the line who are doing the reporting, that they are under intense scrutiny, and that if they report things in a way that the government dislikes, Carr may come after them, and that is necessarily going to have a chilling effect on reporting. Journalists are feeling pressure, I think, to tone down their reporting, especially if it's going to be critical of the Trump administration. We saw, for instance, with the 60 Minutes and CBS news distortion complaint, while that was all going on, we saw the head of CBS News resigned, and an executive producer of 60 Minutes, Bill Owens, also resigned. And Owens has recently come out to The Guardian and said that his bosses were pressuring him, in fact, to avoid certain stories that could generate backlash from the administration, stories about Trump or stories about Gaza. So those impacts are real. The other factor I would mention is that FCC, Anna Gomez on the FCC, the Democratic commissioner, has been doing a speaking tour on the First Amendment. And one thing that she has said repeatedly is that she herself has heard from journalists who are worried about whether their reporting is going to land them in hot water with the FCC, and that they're really thinking hard about this when they're choosing what to cover and how to cover it. And that is just so antithetical to the First Amendment and the government's role when it comes to the press. We're supposed to have a free press in this country. Chairman Carr is not supposed to be putting his thumb on the scale to try to influence reporting, but that's exactly what he's doing with these investigations.
Thanks, Caitlin. I want to, go ahead, Baron. I do want to get back to Caitlin to talk about the ethics complaint that they have filed, but please follow on, Baron.
Yeah, just for context, we talk about the news distortion policy. The FCC has enforced this between 1969 and 2019 only 8 times. And in most of those cases, the way that the rule was enforced, the policy, I should say, there's no written rule, was actually consistent with the broadcast hoax rule. In other words, it was quite narrow. It was about the distortion of news about an emergency or a crime that implicated public safety. In other words, the FCC itself has tried to apply this rule previously in ways that might be consistent with the First Amendment. Brendan is now invoking this concept in order to justify a takeover of the media. So, we get really focused here on these particular examples. We talk about what the Supreme Court has said. But the reality of what's actually happening is that the Federal Communications Commission and the Federal Trade Commission are helping the Trump administration to reshape American media in ways that are wildly unconstitutional and resemble very closely the way that Viktor Orban took over the media in Hungary. And I would just give you two very quick examples. Barry Weiss is now running the entire news division at CBS because of pressure from the FCC. And we just saw a few days ago that prominent media analysts are suggesting that Comcast ought to make Charlie Kirk's widow a top editor of Comcast News Networks because this could win Trump's heart, according to Lightshed partner Rich Greenfield. This is how anticipatory obedience works in authoritarian regimes. The FCC is merely an instrument of this takeover of American media.
And Kate, if I could add, all of these examples show that the celebration that you saw from folks when there was a quick backlash against the takedown of Jimmy Kimmel Live, all these examples show that that was just a very small victory for free speech in a sea of losses that are happening. And so it's important for the public who may not, work in FCC law like Barron or Caitlin do every day to understand that more is happening than what you saw or what you think happened, and that it is time to demand that our representatives in Washington protect free speech better and rein in what is happening at the FCC and the FTC.
Really important points. And I agree. I 100% agree that that getting the public more engaged is really helpful. I also know that you all are thinking really creatively about other ways to push back. So I was hoping to turn to Caitlin to talk about that a little bit in terms of how Freedom of the Press Foundation is thinking about the FCC and Chairman Carr specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the ways that we are pushing back is that we filed an attorney disciplinary complaint against Chairman Carr with the DC bar. He is a licensed attorney in Washington, DC. That means he's subject to the ethical rules that govern attorneys, and he's subject to the disciplinary process. And we think that he has violated those ethical duties left and right. And we filed that complaint ultimately when the FCC finally did approve the merger between Paramount, which owned CBS News, and Skydance. And the timing here and everything is important. So I'm going to just walk through it quickly to explain why we thought that was so unethical the way it all played out. What happened, for people who are not familiar, is that President Trump had filed a billion-dollar lawsuit against CBS News over 60 Minutes and an interview that it did with Kamala Harris that Trump alleged that 60 Minutes had deceptively edited. As Chris said earlier, 60 Minutes eventually released the full transcript of the interview, and you can look for yourself, but I would say there's nothing deceptive about the editing. They just made choices for time. It's called 60 Minutes. They can't have a whole program that goes on and on. So Trump filed this lawsuit. He sought $20 billion in damages, which is just insane. Every media lawyer who looked at this lawsuit said that it was totally frivolous, outrageous, had no legal basis. But the thing that Trump did have is that he had a regulatory cudgel at the Federal Communications Commission because CBS's owner, Paramount, wanted to merge with Skydance. And the FCC needed to approve that merger because of broadcast licenses that would transfer as a result of the merger. And so what Chair Carr did is he reopened the news distortion complaint against CBS that the former chair, Jessica Rosenworcel, had closed properly. He reopened it. And then he also slow-walked the merger approval and just left it hanging out there as Trump's lawsuit continued to play out. And the message that executives at Paramount got was that if they wanted approval of their merger, they were going to have to settle this totally frivolous lawsuit with President Trump. And that was reported widely in the media at the time. Chairman Carr tried to distance himself from that, said, oh, no, the two things have nothing to do with each other. But everyone knew that they were intimately related. And so ultimately what happened was CBS, Paramount, did settle the lawsuit. It paid Trump $16 million. And days later, the FCC approved the merger. And so the timing, coupled with statements that were made as the whole process was playing out, just reeked of unethical behavior and using the FCC to essentially launder a bribe to President Trump. And it's not just us that thinks that. That's been said by, sitting US senators that this was potentially a bribe. And so we filed this ethics complaint based on that activity, but also all of Chairman Carr's unconstitutional investigations into broadcasters and the press, because he's really violating his duties as an attorney. As an attorney, he is supposed to be acting competently, he's supposed to be acting impartially, and he's supposed to be following the Constitution. And if you look at his past statements, he very well knows that he is not. And so we think all of those are ethical violations, and that's why we filed the complaint with the DC Bar. And we think that other groups should be looking, not just at Carr, but at other regulators as well, who may be attorneys, who also have ethical duties and are violating them when they violate the First Amendment.
Well, they're not just violating the First Amendment. They're also violating things like the Constitution's due process guarantees. We at Tech Freedom recently led a letter signed by 70 plus leading scholars of free speech, organizations committed to free speech, and litigators, explaining exactly why Senator Cruz was exactly right in comparing Brendan Carr's tactics to something right out of Goodfellas. This is classic mafioso activity. It violates the First Amendment. It also is obvious prejudgment. He can't possibly judge fairly a case that's brought before him. So, consider what he said recently. He last week said that license revocation, the thing that Donald Trump has been threatening for years, which is effectively the death penalty for a broadcaster, that's on the table. But then in the next sentence, he assured us, oh, people aren't talking about the process. The process will ensure that this is applied fairly. Well, there isn't going to be a fair process because he's already made up his mind. But there won't be any process at all because no one's going to litigate. I mean, this is what Casey had in mind at the outset when he noted that it's not enough for us to have substantive protections on the ground or be able to refer to this and that case. Those things don't matter if these never get before a court. And the reality of the situation is that broadcast licensees or anyone with a merger before the FCC, or as we'll talk about increasingly, tech companies with business before the FTC or the Department of Justice will not resist. They will give the government what it wants. That is anticipatory obedience. It's how authoritarianism takes over entire countries and destroys democracy and the rule of law. So to Chris's point, how do we fix this problem? We have to not only have procedural safeguards in place, but we also have to revisit some of these substantive power dynamics. I mean, as long as you have a situation where a merger is dead once the chairman designates it for hearing, right, that tells you something about the hearing process. If the government doesn't bear the burden of proof, as in a normal competition case, but instead you, as the person wanting to transfer a license, you have to justify that transfer, in other words, your merger, is in the public interest, well, the government holds all the cards. In other words, this is like that classic line from Casablanca, like, oh, gambling here in a casino, what a surprise. We shouldn't really be surprised that the Federal Communications Commission has turned into an instrument for this kind of mafioso tactics because they've always held all the cards. And if they resisted using them, it's only because they've had some sense of self-restraint and there have been some norms against this kind of thuggery that have disappeared. So we can no longer rely on norms. We need statutory safeguards that will get people into court, they will provide damages, and that will actually make it possible for someone to resist what's happening. And if it's not the companies themselves, it's going to be the third parties whose speech is affected, whether that's a journalist or a comedian or the users of internet services, as we'll talk about in the second half.
Kate, can I just add in, the norm breaking in Washington is rampant, that Barron's talking about. It stretches from the White House to these independent agencies that are supposed to be independent, including the White House attempting to fire independent commissioners at these agencies. And we see the Federal Trade Commission. But it also extends to Congress, and this is where the people have to hold their representatives accountable. We have not seen this entire year an oversight hearing around the Federal Communications Commission or the Federal Trade Commission, two key commissions that deal with our communications and technology and internet infrastructure, and the laws and rules around them. This is This is unacceptable given the rapid pace of change in this marketplace, from AI to everything that we're talking about with broadcast and traditional media. Um, it's especially unacceptable given the threats, the long list of threats that we've been describing here. Um, and the people need to demand oversight by their elected representatives. We're going to be hosting an event next month. We call it the People's Oversight Hearing. It pales in comparison, even though we're going to do it as a civil society organization, and many others, Barron and others have been invited to participate. It pales in comparison as to what actual elected representatives in Congress can do with their investigatory power and their oversight authority. And so we'll do what we can to shed a light on what these agencies are and are not doing. But the people need to demand more of their elected representatives. They need to ask them to actually promote the public interest and rein in the power of some of these monopolies that we see in the online tech industry. They need to promote competition and localism, actually, and if it requires, defining what those public interest values are and what they mean and how they're enforced, which I know Barron's interested in, then so be it. But norms are not protecting us anymore in Washington. Um, uh, we also need folks to talk more about in their communities about what free speech means, because it's being twisted here in Washington. Uh, uh, Free speech does mean that folks who disagree with you, and Barron and I have been on many panels together. We don't agree on everything, but we agree on this: that free speech means that we have a right to say what we think. We agree that you have a right to criticize others who disagree with you. And the government should not be putting its thumb on the scale or touching the scale at all when it comes to editorial decisions or speech made by people online on platforms, or editorial or content moderations decision made by digital platforms. And we're seeing that more and more. The hearing that's going on right now, that we're waiting for our friend from Senator Markey's office to join us from, uh, is an example where you have left and right civil society organizations agreeing on what free speech means, and then senators agreeing that they want to influence and even jawbone digital platforms into moderating the way that they want to see moderation happen.
Absolutely, Chris. And I think that's a really good segue to talk a little bit about what we're seeing at the FTC right now. And when you say, oh, Danny, so good to see you.
It's like I said his name, he just appeared.
He just appeared. That's incredible. So hi, everyone. This is Danny Vinnick. He is with Senator Markey's office. I introduced him at the top, but I want to say his name now. Danny, we just talked a little bit about the FCC, but do you want to give us a little bit of an update on the hearing and how any key issues that have been brought up, and any thoughts that you have or key takeaways we should know about?
Yeah, thanks, Kate, and hi, everyone. I apologize for being late. Our hearing ran a little bit long, and I think Senator Cruz is still finishing up the tail end of his questioning over there. This was the second in a two-part series of hearings that Senator Cruz has had on kind of the theory around conservative censorship. He had a few different folks from conservatives world, as well as some free speech experts a couple weeks ago. Today, we're witnesses from Meta and Google, along with a couple other experts as well. And in all honesty, I don't think we tread a lot of new ground today in some of the questioning. I think the members of the committee who have their particular positions that have been kind of long argued about on the Republican side with respect to someone like Senator Schmidt or Senator Cruz have been arguing about there being censorship of conservatives by the tech platforms during the election. And whereas my boss and many other Democrats are much more skeptical of those claims. And this was an opportunity for us for our bosses to have a conversation with the witnesses from Meta and Google and put to them kind of some lingering questions about the scope of their actions, both over the past few years, as well as for my boss. It was important to bring into context some of the actions by the current administration. One thing that he brought up was President Trump's threat last year to jail Mark Zuckerberg, which in my boss's view is just a far more extreme threat than anything that we saw between some emails that might have had curse words in them or things like that. Like it doesn't really get more extreme than threatening to jail somebody for their actions, and that can understandably have an impact on the decision making with respect to content moderation policies. And so, for my boss's question, he wanted to kind of put that in context with some of the statements and arguments coming from the other side. Having said that, I'm not sure there's a ton of news coming out of the hearing itself, but a chance to kind of litigate these arguments again.
Really helpful. Thank you, Danny. So we're going to start talking a little bit about the FTC and some of the things that we have seen the FTC do to try to shape private speech, the authority the FTC does and doesn't have, and also kind of talk through, maybe think a little bit about how Congress has interacted with the FTC, particularly as this administration has purported to fire the Democratic commissioners. And as Chris pointed out earlier, and there still has not been an oversight hearing to discuss these types of unilateral actions by the administration that are going to have an impact on important regulators that have an effect on speech. But first, Barron, I'm hoping to turn to you to talk about the FTC's kind of powers under Section 5, what they are and what they're not, and how they're being reinterpreted right now.
Sure. Well, Andrew Ferguson, chair of the FTC, campaigned very hard for his job. He promised the White House, we have a little one-pager he put together. He promised the White House that he would fight wokeness, he would fight censorship and combat big tech using his consumer protection and competition authority. And they've been making quite a lot of noise about this. The Department of Justice has claimed that reducing the diversity of media is an antitrust injury. All of this really points to what the Supreme Court said in one sentence in its net choice decision last year. That's the one that I referenced at the outset of our conversation. The court broadly upheld the right of tech companies to decide what content to carry and said that's like newspapers. They have the same First Amendment right. But the court noted in one sentence that, of course, media companies are not immune from the application of competition law, generally applicable just as consumer protection law is. And of course, that's true. No one would dispute that. The question is, where is the line? What can you apply the competition and consumer protection laws to? And the short answer is, I think the red line is actually quite clear when you look at First Amendment doctrine. Competition law, consumer protection law, they police business practices, not editorial judgments. And sometimes the line between those is not so obvious. 20 years ago, the Federal Trade Commission was asked to sanction Fox News for lying when it used the slogan "fair and balanced." And the Republican chairman of the agency, of course, dismissed that complaint, saying that that would require the agency to examine the content at issue. And this is a job that the First Amendment bars the Federal Trade Commission from getting involved in. That was the right answer. That's essentially what Joe Simon said as Trump's first FTC chair when Trump and Republican senators tried to cajole the FTC into doing something about anti-conservative bias. That would be the right answer today, but that's not what the two agencies are saying. They are trying to use the competition laws and consumer protection law to police speech they don't like. And ultimately, as I was saying earlier, ultimately the courts will block them. The problem is it could take many years before these cases actually get litigated, and there's no reason to think that these companies actually want to litigate these cases. It won't be like Texas and Florida compelling tech companies to carry specifically odious content where the trade association stepped up and sued. We're talking about individual companies being the target of enforcement actions or having their mergers blocked. This is what happened when Omnicom and IPG wanted to merge to form the largest family of ad buying agencies in the world. And they were cajoled and extorted through gangster tactics that are no less outrageous than what Brendan Carr has been doing by the Federal Trade Commission into, one, agreeing to start buying ads on X, which they had refused to do for editorial reasons, and two, making a complicated set of concessions that are intended to avoid political bias in the purchase of advertising. This is going to get worse. This is just the beginning. And as I said, what we ultimately need here is we need clarity from Congress, ultimately, or the courts. The courts aren't going to do it. If there's a Democratic Congress, they have an opportunity to pass meaningful reforms. And I hope that they'll focus on things like this.
Just a quick follow-up on that, though. You bring up that the courts should vindicate this, but in the Omnicom context and in the context of the FTC settlement with ALO, for example, isn't one of the problems here that no one who is a party to the agreement is incentivized to sue?
Yeah.
Or maybe even has the ability to do so?
Yeah. In the context of mergers, there is no remedy. And more generally, look, the Federal Trade Commission, I 12 years ago called it the de facto Federal Technology Commission because it does regulate data security and privacy through what it calls its common law of consent decrees. And most people in the tech world, didn't mind when the FTC was doing that because they wanted data and security and privacy to be regulated, and Congress wasn't doing anything. And the FTC was dealing with, for the most part, very real harms and was bringing mostly very good cases. But what we saw in that process was that the agency, whether it's in the context of a merger or in bringing its enforcement actions and threatening administrative action, or simply weaponizing the investigation process, the agency is functioning a lot like the Federal Communications Commission does. The FCC holds all the cards because it licenses broadcasters. The FTC has almost the same kind of leverage because companies they have to do what the agency wants them to do. They will agree to all sorts of conditions and to default kinds of regulation. And we're now seeing that happen in this area of media bias. And it doesn't matter that it's wildly unconstitutional because, Kate, as you say, there's no one around who's going to fight back. So, the practical reality is these companies are allowing the FTC to dictate what content looks like online. And there's no Democrat left at the agency to dissent. There's no effective oversight from Congress. The courts aren't going to get involved. So all we can do is document what's happening. We can state our objections. When there's an opportunity to put these issues before a court, we can explain to the court why what's happening is unconstitutional and deeply legally problematic. But all we can do is hang our hooks on whatever procedural tools we have.
Go ahead, Chris, if you wanted to add something. I saw you come off mute.
Well, I completely agree with Barron. And take the Omicron merger example specifically, because in that, Chair Ferguson claimed that the order that they came down with was necessary to prevent the merged advertising agencies from boycotting digital platforms based on political content. That completely misunderstands how media buying works in the marketplace. First of all, it's the advertisers who are hiring these agencies that make placement decisions based on their own brand safety standards, not the agencies. And to call boycotting in a free market somehow a violation of FTC rules or standards is ridiculous. In a free market, the ability to boycott, and we've seen it through the civil rights movement, we've seen it through history, the ability to boycott and choose where you will and won't spend your dollars is an important part of protesting under the First Amendment rights of free speech, and somehow this is dangerous to the current FTC. They also cite to competitive concerns about coordination that harms consumers and reduces competition or lowers product quality. But then what they came down with, as far as their order, doesn't address competitive issues at all. And instead, they're trying to dictate that people must place advertisements in places where they may not want to place advertisements. If you don't want your stuff to be shown, if you don't want your ads to be shown next to content that has hate speech, now you have to figure out a way to make sure that doesn't happen, because Omicron and these agencies that place ads for you are going to be scrutinized when they make those decisions on behalf of their clients, and that is a real threat to free speech that, as Barron said, is not being challenged by the agencies in court, but should be. and it's difficult for others to bring a challenge on based on standing. So it's a real unconstitutional decision, we believe, and if we can find a way to challenge it, we would. But it is difficult legally.
Kate, if I could just jump in,
Yeah,
I wanted to mention
please.
that there is a group that has filed a legal challenge to some of what the FTC is doing, and not in the context of mergers. And I definitely take Chris and Barron's point about the incentives there, but I'm talking about Media Matters for America. And they have actually filed a lawsuit against the FTC after Chairman Ferguson opened an investigation into Media Matters for this report that they published back in 2023, where they found that advertisements on X were appearing next to anti-Semitic content. And this, really angered Elon Musk when they published this report, and he threatened a thermonuclear lawsuit against Media Matters, which he has followed through and sued them. But the other thing that happened is that the FTC opened an investigation into Media Matters, purportedly on the basis of investigating whether they were engaged in anti-competitive behavior by colluding with advertisers to, I guess, boycott X, because after a lot of brands saw this report, they thought, I don't want my content next to anti-Semitic content, and they pulled their ads. But what Media Matters did when it sued is it said, no, this is actually just straight up retaliation for the exercise of our First Amendment rights. And they've won twice. They won a preliminary injunction in the district court, and then that got appealed by the FTC. And most recently, the appeals court affirmed that preliminary injunction and said, yeah, this is likely a retaliatory campaign. They had statements from Ferguson that Barron or Chris alluded to about, going after the woke media, and statements from others at the FTC specifically about Media Matters. And the court said, you can't do this. We still have the First Amendment. So I'm just bringing that up as an example of when companies will stand up and sue. For now, at least, some courts are still standing up for the First Amendment. And I think that's an important thing to remember, because I think we need to be urging corporations, including corporate media, to go to court and to fight to vindicate First Amendment rights.
I'll add one additional thing just from the congressional side of the House here, because of the challenges with litigation, as others have focused on here. We really think it's important that Congress step up its oversight responsibilities here. It's unfortunate. It was great that Chairman Cruz and other Republican senators pushed back on Brendan Carr's threats to Disney and ABC over the Jimmy Kimmel saga. But we're seeing ongoing First Amendment issues left and right. We've talked about the FTC. We've talked about the FCC. We see them across the government. And, political pushback will have an impact here. We just aren't seeing enough of it on the Hill right now. We haven't had an FCC oversight hearing. We haven't had an FTC oversight hearing. Chairman Cruz says those is coming. We think they need to happen soon, given the ongoing and extensive free speech incidents that we've been seeing here. Obviously, if Democrats are strongly on board with this sort of oversight, bringing people in, making sure that they can answer for these questions. Folks on the Hill send a lot of letters to the agencies. Different agencies are better or worse at responding to those questions, and sometimes better or worse at responding to the actual questions we send. We work really hard to try to hold folks' feet to the higher fire, and we need our Republican counterparts to really step up and join us in this fight. We heard a lot about it during the Biden administration, and we would like to see ongoing, congressional oversight in a way that we haven't seen in the past, to aggressively push back on some of the extensive free speech violations that we're seeing. We think that's a really important route, particularly if litigation is slow or difficult to bring in these contexts.
Thanks, Danny. That is really helpful. And we know Senator Markey has been doing his best to raise these issues in letters and in other contexts as well. Hopefully we will get some oversight soon. I think that the committee is going to see Brendan Carr shortly. I did want to turn to one of the audience questions that I think is a really good one, and it's really helpful. So one audience member asks, isn't concentration sought by corporations a threat to free speech at some point? And I wondered whether Barron and Chris, anybody on the panel had some thoughts on that. And I think it came up a bit in the hearing today, particularly from public knowledge's testimony. So I leave it over the floor.
Well, yeah, we were testifying. I guess the hearing's over while I'm here. And our Senior Vice President, Harold Feld, highlighted our concern that promoting competition in markets that tend towards monopoly, markets that tend towards oligopoly, is important to protect free speech. It's also important to protect in an internet ecosystem the free speech of the users of big, large, dominant platforms. So while we defend the right for a platform to moderate content, and we defend the right for a platform to choose not to moderate content under the First Amendment, you want to empower the user so that the government does not step in. You want to empower the user through as much competition as possible. And that may be an area where, folks like Barron and I may disagree on how to get that competition, but we are actively seeking pro-competition regulation that proactively pushes for choices in the marketplace for consumers so that if you want to be on Truth Social, go on Truth Social. I don't want to be there. They don't moderate enough for my taste. But if I don't want to be on Facebook, I should have an alternative of somewhere where I can go. And so we think promoting interoperability on social, promoting protocols that make it easier to build interoperable platforms is a way to try to promote the competition that we're looking for, to have non-discrimination rules or non-preferencing rules for dominant platforms. These are sorts of things we've been proposing to try to get at the consumer choice that you need that also protects free speech without the government coming in and getting into the decisions around the actual content that's being put online.
Hey, this is a complicated topic. It's one that deserves a lot more in-depth discussion than we got at the hearing today or the hearing 2 weeks ago, to be frank. So first of all, the Supreme Court's been very clear that concentration in an industry doesn't change the application of the First Amendment. So big companies, small companies, they have the same rights. They can't be compelled to carry content. Now the question is there a role for government in trying to restructure a market? Because the idea that some people have that perhaps a less concentrated market would be less vulnerable to jawboning. In the case of broadcasters, small broadcasters are still totally vulnerable to the agency. They are still owned by the chairman, in effect. Now, it might be the case, I don't think there's nothing to this. It might be the case that certain large companies feel particularly vulnerable, especially if they want to get a deal done. It's not coincidental that Nexstar was one of the two broadcast groups that said that even after Disney reinstated Kimmel, that they weren't going to show Kimmel because they had a deal they wanted to get done before the FCC. Comcast has a deal right now that they want approval for. That's why some of their analysts are proposing that they should suck up to the administration by putting a MAGA person in charge of their news policy, just as Barry Weiss has been put in charge of CBS. I mean, it's possible that there are some areas where there's more leverage to be exerted. But my concern is we need to think about the structure of regulation. If the structure of regulation is such that the regulators have discretion and you bear the burden to justify your merger, it doesn't really matter how concentrated the industry is. The government is going to exert pressure to get what it wants. That's the kind of thing that we need to be focused on, not just endlessly focused on this, frankly, fairly stale debate about media consolidation. I mean, I think it's quite sad that in the last two hearings, Congressional Senate Democrats, I should say, had given to them on a golden platter by Senator Cruz the correct framing for understanding what is happening. This is Goodfellas. This is the mafia trying to shake down American media. And for the most part, Senator Markey maybe was a little better about this than some of the other senators. But the chairwoman, or the ranking member, I should say, and several Democratic members only wanted to talk about media consolidation. I mean, that is a missed opportunity. That is not the primary problem. The primary problem is the weaponization of the regulatory state and the lack of due process safeguards to protect those that are regulated and those that have to get approval or that are subject to competition suits or consumer protection suits. If we don't deal with those problems, there is no retinkering with the structure of media markets we could do that will prevent this kind of weaponization by an authoritarian government in the future. We need to examine the process of regulation and assess why the First Amendment is effectively meaningless in today's regulatory environment.
Anybody else want to speak to that? If no, that's okay.
Well,
I just thought I'd check.
I'll just say I do think, what Varen described as foundational is foundational when it comes to protecting against, government encroachment on First Amendment power. I think then when you add the competition side to it, that's where you get the markets that we're looking for. And so, we're very concerned about the likelihood that the FCC chairman will roll back media ownership rules. We've also already seen other pro-competition uh, uh, broadcaster policies get rolled back, whether it's the ability to, or sorry, the rules against joint negotiations by broadcasters, anything that makes the local broadcasters all of a sudden act in concert. The consolidation in the marketplace that we've seen with Nexstar and Sinclair owning multiple local broadcasters and therefore taking the localism out of local broadcasting. All those things create, if we were to address those competitive issues, would give us a marketplace that I think with limited spectrum for these broadcasters promotes diversity of voices, diversity of content, and localism. And then I already made the argument for it on the tech sector side. It doesn't mean that Barron's wrong about the foundational First Amendment rights, but there's more that we need to do to help folks in our pluralistic society feel like there are different outlets and different choices for them as consumers and users of the technology and media.
Well, Truth Social and Parler and Gab and Rumble say exactly the same thing. They want to weaponize the very legislation, especially on the online side of things, that many on the left have promoted. And I think we have to be exceedingly careful about stress testing that kind of legislation. I'm talking about the Open App Market Act that I think would be a Bill of Rights for Parler to try to force or Gab to try to force mainstream app stores to carry their apps. We need to be very careful about the non-discrimination prohibitions in the American Innovation Choice Online Act. Because we need to understand the reason Republicans are supporting those bills is because they think those bills will advance this sort of fringe tech services small platforms like Truth Social or apps that don't get carriage right now for editorial reasons. And this is why I keep going back to this red line between business judgment and editorial judgment, right? We can police business practices and business judgments. Chris, we can have a debate, but we have to be very careful in understanding that new legislation we create or existing lawsuits that may seem like they're policing business practices can be used to try to reshape editorial decision making, despite the First Amendment. That's what I'm concerned about. And those laws, those pending bills, need to be stress tested much more carefully. Our concerns have been dismissed routinely again and again.
Kate, you might need to do a whole other panel on this because
We might need to. Yeah.
yeah, I want to go on and on about how competition promotes free speech.
It's a really important discussion. I think it's worth having. I think that complicated problems require complicated solutions, or at least complex solutions, which might mean like two things can be true at once. And the other thing to think about is, regulation always involves some sort of trade-off. And the question is whether the trade-offs are worth it. And, in the current environment, what trade-offs are worth it are really worth considering. But since we've only got 4 minutes left, my goodness, this has been such a good conversation. I did want to talk about some of the overarching things that we have seen and that we've talked about, and make sure that folks get to make points about things that maybe we didn't get to address in the meat of the discussion. But one main theme we've seen is that many industry players are willing to negotiate and agree to some pretty concerning settlement conditions. Why is this happening? I think we've touched on this a little bit, but how do we what are the incentives that need to change, and how can we change them to try to get more industry participants to stand up against jawboning? We actually heard a fair amount of cajoling towards standing up against jawboning in the hearing today, at least at the outset. So I'm curious what folks think about how we address that.
I can start. I mean, I think the answer seems probably fairly obvious to many people on this panel, is that it's corporate interests that are winning out over the backbone to defend the First Amendment. It's the desire to make money. And it's greed, frankly, I think that's causing a lot of these corporate entities not to stand up and fight back. And in some ways, they are the victims, as Barron was saying. They are controlled by the chair, but in other ways, they still have power, and they could be using it. And I think that one way we need to encourage them to use it is to use our power as consumers. And so we saw, for instance, when ABC quickly took Jimmy Kimmel off the air, that generated a huge backlash and calls to boycott. And that seemed to get Disney's attention. And the news came out later that, in fact, massive numbers of subscribers did immediately unsubscribe. And that, I think, was somewhat effective. I think another tactic that people should be thinking about is their rights as shareholders of these companies. A lot of these companies are publicly traded. And one thing that we've looked into at Freedom of the Press Foundation is what rights do shareholders have to push back when companies make decisions that ultimately harm not just the First Amendment, but because they're news companies, they also harm the corporate bottom line too, because when you undermine the First Amendment, you undermine the ability to gather the news and be a broadcaster of news. And so there are rights under Delaware law, for example, where most of these companies are incorporated, for shareholders to demand transparency about these decisions, or even take further actions that can result in monetary damages that go not back to the shareholders, but back to the company themselves. So you're not taking anything away from a news outlet, but you're kind of enforcing against officers of the company that may be undermining the news outlet and undermining the First Amendment. Those then have to pay back to the company the damage that they've caused. So I would say those are two kind of mechanisms that people need to be looking at to bring some power back to the people in these decision-making processes.
I know we're almost out of time. I would second everything Caitlin said. I think the thing I would add is the momentum towards censorship right now is really strong. And so no company wants to be the one to stick their neck out and face the blowback that comes from the administration, because it's going to be intense. And so there's definitely a little bit of a chicken and egg problem here, where if everyone, shook hands and just decided to jump first, there might be a, greater strength in numbers to push back on this administration. And we might need to see more of that, someone taking a chance, someone pushing back, because, and you saw this from Chairman Cruz and Republicans, like, Brendan Carr will think twice before he makes an aggressive comment like that or something like that, because he knows that his political support on the Hill might not be what he thought it was. We need to see more of that, because that is the sort of deterrent effect that can start to shift the incentives for companies. That's the sort of shift that will make administration officials start to think twice about what that political support looks like, and therefore the extent to which that they can take these actions. It happens inch by inch over time. Like Caitlin said, I think folks voting with their wallets is an important piece of this too. It will help give some courage to these companies to stand up, and the ball can, this flywheel effect can go in the opposite direction as it's going now.
I'm not quite
Thank you so much. We have like 1 minute left. So Danny and Chris, I'd love to hear from you for a closing remark. Oh, I'm sorry. I meant Barron and Chris.
Yeah, I don't think very much is going to change. Chairman Carr might be slightly more subtle about what he's doing, but he's going to continue to exert the kind of pressure he's exerted. So I think what we need is a systemic reassessment of how we govern this space. Whatever you might say about Europe's Digital Services Act, at least they went through the process of trying to assess what the enforcement process would look like. We don't have that in the United States, especially what the Federal Trade Commission does is there are no governing statutory standards. We need those. And if we don't get them, we're going to see this kind of extortion continue to happen.
And I'm also interested in some of the transparency ideas that Caitlin and others have suggested. It's noteworthy that, Google, I saw the beginning of their testimony today. They were trying to be as transparent as possible. There's no transparency standards on them, but they admit that they were pressured by the Biden administration, and they also say their decisions are independent. As much transparency as possible hopefully can show that when companies are jawboned versus just being influenced by the bully pulpit, and the distinction is important when we talk about censorship. So we need to continue to shed light on these instances, because we're not always going to have a chairman who says publicly what he is doing, like Chairman Carr has.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chris, Caitlin, Barron, and Danny, for a fascinating and really illuminating discussion. I really appreciate you joining us. And I think that is going to have to bring this panel to a close, and maybe we will do a follow-up on competition with just Baron and Chris. But thank you, everybody. I am going to move us on to our next section of the programming. We're gonna move on to our lightning talks. This section will spotlight experts who have been directly impacted by government pressure. We are allowing questions for the presentations, but because the presentations are brief, it's going to be up to the speaker whether to address them. So first, I want to turn the floor over to Bradley Price of the Bluegrass Student Collective. Bradley, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bradley Price. I'm a senior majoring in English Literature and Pan-African Studies at the University of Louisville, and I'm the president of the Bluegrass Student Collective, formerly the Student Coalition for DEI. And my presentation is going to follow the attacks on DEI in higher education and what it means for academic freedom and freedom of speech outside the walls of higher education. I made this presentation along with other members of the Bluegrass Student Collective, Alexandria Groves and Savannah Dow. So much of the credit of this presentation and the research behind it goes to them as well. Let's start with defining DEI. There's a stark difference in what DEI actually is and what not only the right, but also well-meaning people on the left call DEI. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are guiding principles meant to give marginalized people more equal and access to spaces in which they were previously discriminated against. So these aren't just diversity trainings, but it's also hiring practices. But DEI has turned into a catch-all for anything remotely connected to race, gender, sexuality, and disability. In Kentucky, for example, lawmakers have attacked race-based scholarships, banned gender-based scholarships, shut down offices and resource centers, mandated so-called institutional viewpoint neutrality, attacked numerous courses, accused of indoctrination, and even banned bias investigations. That leaves us in a really absurd position where we're begging for the bare minimum for institutions to not be openly racist. So when we are asked what we're fighting for, the answer is clear. We're fighting for the right of minority communities to have access to higher education and for the very future of higher education itself. The anti-DEI crusade started in 2021 in reaction to widespread Black Lives Matter organizing in the pursuit of racial justice. Christopher Rufo, he's one of the main architects of the movement. He developed the villain of critical race theory against caricatures of scholarship on race, gender, and sexuality in K through 12 schools specifically. Well-organized think tanks started pumping out model legislation for state legislature and talking points for the shifting narrative on education. By 2022, the attack on CRT started morphing into an all-encompassing term, DEI, which increasingly came to include queer folks and women. The next year, North Dakota first banned DEI in higher education, then Florida, then Texas, and then all the dominoes started crashing down. In 2024, Kentucky Republicans attempted to pass 2 anti-DEI bills. The first one was introduced by Senator Mike Wilson. It stated that students and employees of post-secondary educational institutions wouldn't be penalized for not supporting so-called divisive concepts. House Bill 9, which was the more impactful bill, was introduced by Representative Jennifer Decker. It was created to terminate all diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and initiatives, which also originally applied to academic course content, and eliminated all DEI offices in positions that promoted so-called discriminatory concepts. That bill failed. That although there was widespread backlash from communities around Kentucky, the bill mostly failed because Republican infighting surrounding the amendments made to the bills when they passed their respective chambers. So they just ran out of time to pass the bill. Moving us to like February 2025, Jennifer Decker introduced House Bill 4. House Bill 4 was originally intended to be a copy of House Bill 9 from the year before. It eliminated all DI offices in post-secondary educations in Kentucky, post-secondary institutions in Kentucky. Its current version requires for the Council on Post-Secondary Education to create an oversight committee that monitors viewpoint diversity at public universities. Universities to host surveys to make sure that the viewpoint diversity is being promoted on their campuses, and eliminates all DI offices and initiatives. Like mentioned earlier, in many states there have been like conservative think tanks behind these anti-DEI laws that we're seeing, such as the Heritage Foundation, which is famously the group behind Project 2025. They were behind the anti-DEI bill that recently passed in Ohio, which limited course content and eliminated every DEI office in Ohio, higher education, also known as SB1. In Kentucky, behind HB4 was the Goldwater Institute, which is also a conservative think tank that has been behind a lot of these anti-DEI bills across the United States. Unfortunately, despite the best efforts of like students, faculty, and staff from across the state of Kentucky, House Bill 4 passed. We've already started seeing the impacts of it on our campuses. Our beloved cultural center our beloved cultural center at the University of Louisville has been renamed, and a lot of the initiatives have been cut. At the University of Kentucky, they have completely closed their cultural center, and across the state of Kentucky, gender inclusive housing has been axed. Vital programming that advanced the scholarship of marginalized students has been scrapped with little remorse. University administrations hurriedly removed the word diversity from all bylaws, web pages, and marketing in hopes of being spared from the wrath of the General Assembly. These effects are real, and we're all feeling them here in Kentucky. But the truth of the matter is that the anti-DEI crusade is only a symptom of something far more sinister and expansive than many of us realized. If you're a college student, you've probably been exposed to this sense of increasing distrust of higher ed. They often take forms of myths that professors indoctrinate children and students, or that students are running campuses with mob violence. But why are these myths so popular? And more importantly, what do these myths serve? The ultimate goal of anti-DEI rhetoric and all of its anti-academic freedom compadres is to discredit, disparage, and undermine the legitimacy of institutions of higher education, and the flames of anti-intellectualism are just burning around the world. Anti-DEI bans are not just about DEI, they're also attacks on academic freedom. But conservative and Republican attacks on DEI are the only thing that's chipping away at freedom of speech on college campuses. After October 7th, 2023, the crackdown that we've seen on Students for Justice in Palestine protesters on so-called progressive campuses and by Democratic politicians has turned colleges into sites of political oppression. At the University of Louisville, our Students for Justice in Palestine chapter has been increasingly repressed by our university administration, who calls itself the most progressive university in the South. The increasing repression can be seen when Columbia opened the gates of university presidents turning into replicas of authoritarians and fascist leaders when they sicked the NYPD on their students in 2023. And gave the green light for universities to subject their students to political violence and violence from outside organizations. This can also be seen at UCLA, where administrators allowed counter protesters from outside of campus to attack SJP student organizers. None of these actions are happening in a vacuum, and they all go towards the same outcome: students, staff, and faculty having less freedom of speech on campus. Universities are microcosms of society, and the increasing authoritarianism that is being encouraged by university administrations, such as Texas passing a bill that limits public engagement with university campuses and protests on those campuses, will ultimately leak out of these institutions and harm us all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bradley, for that really important presentation. I really appreciate you joining us today. Now I'd like to welcome Molly Stark-Dean, a journalist and Wikipedia editor. Molly, over to you.
Hi, I'm giving. Do you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Molly Starkdean. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm an unemployed journalist looking for her next newsroom, but you nerds can call me Professor Dean. And today, for one brief shining moment, I want you to look past the smoke, the mirrors, the algorithms, and the promises of open knowledge. We're talking about gender inequality, systematic, irrefutable, and bigger than any main event in history. Can everybody see this? Yeah. Humans and non-humans, you might be thinking, Professor Dean, maybe women don't just want to edit. Wrong. The evidence is clear. Women who step into this digital ring face more traps than an undercard rookie. Notability rules weaponized. Hostile, male-dominated culture, standard issue. And don't forget the endless maze of technical barriers. It's not the audience that's hiding women, but it's the system. Beloved friends and tolerated acquaintances, why does this matter beyond Wikipedia? Because Wikipedia is the training ground for artificial intelligence, the source for millions, billions of school children, journalists, and yes, machine learning models. When bias infects Wikipedia, it spreads, it echoes, it amplifies. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Molly Starkdean. I'm a woman. I'm a journalist and looking for my next newsroom, but I'm most proud of being a Wikimedian. What are you waiting for? This isn't just someone else's battle. It's your moment. Join Women Do News and bring your voice to the revolution. Our next Wiki NYC celebration will be a collective quarter life crisis. The best party all year, Wikipedia Day in January. That's not a prediction, it's a spoiler.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Molly. That was really important and helpful. Thank you so much. I'd now like to welcome Anna Lenhart from the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics to share her insights.
All right. Can you see me? Can you see my screen? I'm going to take that as
yes,
yes.
and yes.
All right,
Thanks,
great. So my name is Anna Lenhart. I am both a policy fellow scholar at GW and a PhD student at the University of Maryland. And I'm going to be talking about how the Trump administration is censoring information science researchers. Maybe I can go to the next slide. 1 second. Okay. So you all have seen the headlines. The Pentagon, the National Science Foundation, and the National Institutes of Health have been cutting hundreds of research grants. And they aren't random. They're specifically targeting research that contain keywords related to things like disinformation, conspiracy theories, and hate speech. These cuts have hit the information science field quite hard. And I just want to go through a few examples from the canceled grants database. So engineers at UC Boulder were exploring ways to get around internet censorship in China. Researchers at Rutgers were working on ways to figure out how social media flagging systems can be more fair. The University of Washington had a grant focused on tools that let users and communities curate social media content themselves. MIT had a project on promoting accurate information online, and there were dozens of projects aimed at detecting deepfakes. And of course, there were a few projects that studied how health misinformation and conspiracy theories spread on the internet. But going through the database, I was really struck on how aligned many of these projects are with US values around free expression. So kind of bigger picture, like why does this research matter? Researchers that study social media, they often focus on what's sometimes called legal but harmful content. So these are things like disinformation or harassment, categories where everyone on this call probably has a slightly different definition and a slightly different idea of what to do about edge cases. And this is exactly the kind of content I don't want the government to be regulating with a heavy hand, but I want to acknowledge that it does cause harm. And that's where NSF-funded research plays an important role. These scholars commit to rigorous and transparent methods, which means that the government is essentially funding independent experts to define categories of legal but harmful in different ways, and then better understand how that content and platform design impacts users, youth mental health, democratic discourse. This research is then used by actors throughout society. So journalists will use it to explain tech issues to the public. Legislators rely on it when crafting laws that target product design as opposed to speech. Government agencies will reference it to understand foreign interference in US elections. And platforms will sometimes change their trust and safety practices based on this research, but that is their prerogative and voluntary. So these funding cuts will ultimately slow an important source of information critical for upholding democracy and protecting consumers. But it also really hits early career researchers the hardest. I've been hearing, and there's been reporting, that senior scholars are hesitant to take on PhD students this year because they can't guarantee funding for the length of the student's program. This means we are looking at a 5 to 10 year potential generation gap with fewer scholars trained to understand the online information environment. Unfortunately, funding cuts are not the only threat facing researchers who study social media. We've also seen a wave of political pressure. For example, Congressman Jim Jordan, who chairs the House Judiciary Committee, has been using his position to send requests for information and even subpoenas to academic and civil society researchers studying how misinformation spreads. This started last Congress, but is continuing today in connection to European tech policy, which I'll circle back to. Earlier this year, the Alliance Defending Freedom filed public records requesting and targeting 5 public universities. They were claiming these universities are part of the censorship industrial complex or censorship regime. And then in May, the State Department went so far as to demand internal communications with and about specific researchers, journalists, and European officials. Taken together, all of these actions have a clear purpose: to intimidate researchers, but they also do something else. They spread and reinforce several false narratives. False narrative 1, this idea that platform content moderation is the same thing as censorship. It's not. Private companies are not the government. They are allowed to enforce their terms of service, whether or not they choose to consult with researchers. False narrative 2, the claim that university research centers are somehow an extension of the government. This is just not true. Agencies like the NSF fund independent research, but they don't dictate the findings. And government agencies have long engaged outside experts in policy through roundtables, task forces, advisory councils, and the State Department is no different. So the bigger goal here really seems to be discrediting academic researchers altogether, which my former colleague also said. and, trying to make scholars look like political actors as opposed to unaffiliated knowledge generators. If this administration actually cared about corporate abuse of power and the monopoly's role in our information environment, they could, mark up a host of proposed online transparency legislation. For example, there's the Bipartisan Internet PACT Act, which requires social media companies to report on the enforcement of their terms of service. There's the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, which focuses on ensuring researchers are able to access data. There's the Digital Services Online Safety Act, which actually includes specific reporting requirements related to when a platform makes a content moderation decision based on a trusted organization, which would be, a research institution, or at the request of a government. And then the SMART Act is model text drafted by FIRE, which would require social media platforms to report when they remove content based on a US government agency's request, including if that government worked with, researchers or engaged researchers. None of these bills are necessarily perfect, but they all deserve discussion. But instead of discussion and debating these real potential solutions, this administration is actively trying to undermine efforts like the European Digital Services Act. The DSA is one of the first major laws in the world that actually gives researchers access to platform data. It requires companies to report on how they make content moderation decisions and gives users ways to appeal those decisions. In continuation of work started last Congress, Representative Jim Jordan's committee is holding hearings and demanding documentation and correspondence related to academics and civil society organizations that have been involved in a rather democratic process to implement the Digital Services Act. Relatedly, this administration is restricting visas for European officials who work on laws like the DSA. These officials regularly come to the United States to meet with our experts and scholars and to have open debate, including open debate about the US First Amendment. I am really worried that these attacks are giving online platforms the kind of permission slip. Permission to cut off data access for researchers, to shut down fact-checking programs that were often the subject of academic study, to shrink their trust and safety teams. But perhaps more importantly, I worry that online platforms will feel emboldened to undermine international transparency laws like the Digital Services Act. So here we are in a moment in history where more people than ever get their news from social media. And yet, with restricted funds and data access, it's becoming one of the hardest times in modern history to actually study these platforms. It's more difficult than ever to study how information spreads, but also to study solutions that could make the internet a space for productive discourse, which I definitely would like to see more of in this country that I love. But this is not an accident. This is exactly the outcome that leaders with authoritarian tendencies would hope for. If the Trump administration can paint researchers as machines for censorship, they can shift the narrative. They can distract from their own efforts to silence activists, journalists, librarians, comedians, all while ensuring that Trump-instigated lies and hateful rhetoric spread far and wide on social media platforms. I want to end with a humble reminder that authoritarians shape misleading narratives by pulling on threads of truth that linger in the zeitgeist. Over the years, lawmakers from both sides of the aisle have introduced social media bills that were misguided, proposals that really could have threatened free expression online. And researchers are inherently tied to institutions of higher education, institutions that promise opportunity in exchange for staggering debt, and for many Americans fail to make do on this promise. Institutions that too often prioritize exclusivity over reaching more students. This makes academic researchers a prime target for people who are legitimately frustrated and feel left behind. For those of us who care deeply about democracy, we have to call out how this administration is targeting and censoring researchers, but we also have to make that the case that academia and the knowledge it produces belongs to everyone. I think this will ultimately require thoughtful higher education policy and reform, but that is a topic for another conference. Thanks so much. I'm happy to chat more.
Anna, thank you so much for that thorough presentation and a really good reminder that you cannot address problems that you can't see. And if we don't have access to the data, we cannot understand what is going on, and therefore we cannot take action to address it, whatever it might be, to begin with. Really appreciate you taking the time, and everyone should reach out to Anna with more questions if they have them. So finally, I'd like to welcome Alastair Kitchen. He's a journalist whose work covering protests here in the United States got a fair amount of attention earlier, but I'll let him tell you about it. Thanks for coming.
And thank you, everyone. I don't have a presentation for you, but I do have a personal story, which I think should shed some light on jawboning and the chilling of speech more generally. In the United States and around the world, you can probably tell that I'm not in the US right now. I'm in Australia. I'm on Jajawaran country. It's north of Melbourne. In June of this year, I was flying to the US, flying to New York, where I had lived for about 6 years. When I was stopped at LAX, denied entry, detained, and then deported by Customs and Border Protection for writing that I had done while at Columbia, reporting on the protests, the pro-Palestinian protests there. I'm quite lucky that I know that that was the reason I was targeted. I know that I was targeted for my writing because the officers who detained me very proudly and explicitly told me so. I stepped off the plane. I went to get into that long passport processing queue that I'm sure a lot of you know, although it's always longer for non-US passport holders. And before I even got in the queue, the voice came over the loudspeaker. Alistair Kitchen, please report to the officer at the back of the room. I went to the officer. I was immediately pulled into detention and interrogated. And the first thing that was said to me was that I had been targeted because of my writing at Columbia. I had been a creative writing student doing an MFA at Columbia in studying nonfiction. When the protests broke out on the lawn in front of me, I thought it was incumbent upon me as a writer and as a student to write down what I saw. I wrote what I saw on Substack. I didn't think anyone read my blog, but it turned out that the US government did. So once I was detained and told that the reasons for my detention, I was interrogated for some time on my views on Israel, on Palestine, on the conflict and what I would call the genocide more broadly, what I think Israel should do differently, what I think Hamas should do differently, my own preferred solution to the crisis, whether or not I preferred a 1 versus 2 state solution. I was asked to give up the names of students that I knew who were protesting. I was asked to give up WhatsApp groups that I had been involved with. I was given a full, ideological rundown. This is at a airport where one is normally asked, if one's there for work or pleasure. You can read everything that I wrote. It's back up online, and I can tell you right now that I'd be surprised if anyone in this chat disagreed with anything that I wrote back on my Substack. But crucially, in preparation for that flight, knowing how dangerous US borders can be, had scrubbed my online presence. Nonetheless, CBP had read my material at least 72 hours before I got on the plane. They were so across my work and my writing and had done so far before I got on the plane that they didn't even know that I had taken that material down before I departed for the US. That, I think, suggests a level of scrutiny and surveillance that I wasn't prepared for. I had prepared for what I call an ad hoc, cursory search at the border. But I instead came up against something much more sophisticated, whether or not I had been targeted by CBP because of a sophisticated online search using data tools that we know CBP is increasingly accessing, or because my name may have been included on a list given to the US government by such organizations as Beta US or Canary Mission, I don't know. All I know is that I spent the next 12 hours in detention before I was put on the next plane back to Australia. Along the way, my phone was searched. I made the mistake of handing over the passcode to my phone. I had been given the option of accepting immediate deportation or handing over the passcode to my phone. And out of a sense of naivety and hope, I allowed them to do it. They plugged my phone into a forensic software. They searched it for who knows what. Eventually, they came out and said, "Mr. Kitchen, we found evidence of drug use on your phone. What do you have to say about that? You did not attest to having consumed drugs when you applied for your visa waiver program." Of course, like many, I have bought marijuana in New York, where it's legal at a state level, but illegal at a federal level. And I've consumed other drugs in other countries, and I told them so. So if you ask, CBP today why I was deported, they have this pretextual reason. They have a real reason that, and they have full discretion to deny someone such as me entry into the US. But what we know by their own admission is that the reason for my targeting, the reason for my denial of entry was political and speech-based, rather than having anything to do with drugs. So I'll just close by raising one or two things. The first is that the US Constitution does, more or less a pretty good job of protecting Americans and US passport holders. It does a less good job, in practice is clear, of protecting people who don't have US passports, even when those people are on US soil. Borders are points of vulnerability. People who cross borders are often without status, and they are at the mercy of a capricious and cumbersome bureaucracy that is filled with individuals who may not share the ideology of the traveler. There clearly has been, as I wrote the day that Mahmoud Khalil was arrested, a policy of the US government, which I call the deportation of dissent, which uses immigration as a way of controlling and chilling speech in the United States. And in my own story, it's unclear to me, even now, the degree to which I was highly targeted by a intentional and self-conscious actor or actors in the United States government, or if I fell into the sort of broad, cumbersome machine and got unlucky. Nonetheless, my story, I think, is emblematic of a broad atmosphere of intimidation, a chilling atmosphere that works very hard to maintain a homogeneity of speech in the US. And I think it's incumbent upon writers, creative people, and all people to press back against that homogeneity, to accept that speech does have costs. Truth-telling has costs, but it's nonetheless worth it. I'm not sure how much time I've taken up, but I'll stop here, and if there's still more time, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Alistair, for sharing your story. It's incredible and a crucial reminder for all of us at this time. We would love to open it up to questions right now. And I would also say that our next panel is going to address some of what Alistair talked about, and that'll be coming up at 2 p.m. But first, if I don't see questions at the moment, but Molly, I wanted to turn it back to you to talk a little bit about your recent experiences at WikiCon.
So, not this past Friday, but the Friday beforehand, there was a protester at a WikiCon North America event. Wikipedia has haters in all corners of the internet, and this specifically was someone who was protesting that pedophiles can't be wiki editors. He is a non-contact map or male attracted person. I've never heard of this sector of the internet, but he got up in front of the conference. I was 2 feet away from him, and he stuck a loaded gun to his head and threatened to kill himself. This is an uplifting story though, because two Wikipedia volunteers who are organizers with the conference, which I'm also an organizer of this conference, got up and without any guns, got up and thwarted the attack. One got behind, well, these are wiki volunteers. One got involved and basically hugged him behind, and then another Wikipedia volunteer pried the gun from this man's hand. And so I've been talking to people all week about this incident. It was a little shocking to me. Wikipedia normally has haters, just always in general. I mean, in 2023, there was a bomb threat against WikiCon North America. So the truth is always under attack, and this is just the most recent reminder that of what we all stand up for. And so this story, from the attack to having to deal with every single corner of the internet's communities, is a little this was my first introduction to this sort of thing, and it was like feet away from me. I was standing in the front row. Not only was I standing in the front row, but I grabbed my fellow Women Do News chair to sit in the front row because it was the safest place. Because we're both immunocompromised, I said, oh, well, if you sit in the front, we'll be safe. I also told someone 10 minutes before this happened, a Canadian, I said, oh, it's safe here in New York City. Don't worry. I know America is dangerous with all of our guns, but that doesn't happen here in New York City. So, yeah, that's what happened at WikiCon North America.
Absolutely terrifying. And, especially in this particular context, there are so many different threats to Wikipedia itself. It's pretty obvious that editing an online encyclopedia should not be life-threatening. And yet things like this continue to happen. And my concern is the through line that I see through every single one of your presentations, that the physical threat that people undergo simply for telling their truth, or engaging in like online editing, engaging in protests, engaging in research, engaging in journalism. Absolutely harrowing. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for your work with Wikipedia and your work trying to turn that resource into one that is more gender equitable. It's incredibly important. I say that as someone who worked for Wikipedia for a long time.
Yeah, and Kate, I Wikipedia, and I through activism where I'm just yelling at it normally, and the fact that I'm also supporting Wiki just in general is just a weird sideways in. And I'm a journalist, and I'm a professor, so all sorts of attacks on me in general.
Thank you for having, A, for being available, and B, for having the courage to come and talk to us about it. Are there any other questions or anything else folks would like to share with our lightning talk experts? All right. Seeing nothing. Hi, Faiza. I will get to your panel in just 1 minute. Thank you so much for joining. So thank you all. Thank you, Anna and Alistair, Bradley, and Molly. We really appreciate you joining and telling your story and sharing your expertise with us. Thank you so much. Okay. So as we heard from Alistair, journalists and non-citizens are experiencing significant threats to their free expression. His story is one of many examples of the federal government punishing non-citizens for their protected speech. In recent months, that campaign has only intensified. To lead our discussion of the weaponization of social media monitoring against non-citizens particularly, I'll be turning things over to Tom Bowman, Policy Counsel with CDT's Security and Surveillance team in just a moment. But first, a reminder that we're taking audience questions throughout the session. If you're connecting through Zoom webinar, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the window. If you're following on the live stream, you can submit questions via email at questions@cdt.org or via X or Blue Sky using hashtag CDT questions, hashtag FOSO2025, and @SendDemTech. Tom, over to you to welcome our panel.
Thank you so much, Kate, for the introduction, and I'll invite our panelists for this last panel here to turn their videos on. I know that we're getting started a little bit early, so I understand if there is any issues, but we'll turn to each of you eventually here. But good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our final panel of the Future of Speech Online. This panel is titled The Weaponization of Social Media Monitoring. My name is Tom Bowman, and as Kate said, I serve as Policy Counsel on the Security and Surveillance Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology. At CDT, I work on issues at the intersection of privacy, security, and emerging technology, focusing on government surveillance, encryption, and the impact of technology on marginalized communities. And I'm truly excited to be moderating this incredible group of experts today. We're here to discuss what is a rapidly growing, frequently opaque, and deeply concerning practice, that is, the government monitoring of social media. Both in the US and abroad, governments are increasingly using social media monitoring to, and I want to emphasize my heavy skepticism here, to quote, vet individuals and inform law enforcement investigations, which are really precursors to critical decisions about people's lives with massive civil rights implications, like whether a student is permitted to travel for education, whether an individual should continue to receive an immigration benefit, and frankly, whether we all can continue to express our views online without fear of retaliation. Now, social media monitoring tools are often justified in the nature or the name of national security, but they raise profound questions about the impacts on our exercise of civil rights. What happens when the tools used to scan our online speech are inaccurate or biased or lack context? What are the consequences when non-citizens, including permanent residents, are denied benefits, detained, or deported based on their political viewpoints, or even just the post of their friends? This practice of social media monitoring creates pervasive chilling effect, discouraging speech, and especially dissent for fear of being misinterpreted or flagged by a government agent, or in some cases, an algorithm. Today, we will explore the tools and policies driving this surveillance, the flaws that make it so dangerous, and the very real impact it has on free expression for everyone. Throughout the conversation, I encourage members of the audience to put questions in the chat or the Q&A feature or submit them via email as Kate outlined. And unfortunately, I can't promise that we're going to be able to answer every question live, but we hope that the audience can help shape this conversation to address the most important concerns related to social media monitoring, especially as you see them. So now I'd like to introduce the distinguished experts who will be joining me for this important conversation. I'm going to first introduce each of them and then eventually invite some guided opening remarks. First, we have Faiza Patel, the Senior Director of the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program. Faiza is a nationally recognized expert on government surveillance and its impact on civil liberties, particularly its targeting of minority communities. She's testified before Congress in favor of limits on government surveillance programs, and her writing has been featured in many major publications, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, making her a leading voice on these issues. Next, we have Jennifer Huddleston, a senior fellow in technology policy at the Cato Institute. Jennifer's research focuses on the intersection of emerging technology and law, with a particular interest in online speech, content moderation, and data privacy. She too has testified before Congress on her research and has been published widely, bringing a sharp legal lens to tech policy debates. Joining them is Will Creeley, the legal director at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, or FIRE. Since joining FIRE in 2006, Will has been on the front lines defending civil rights, coordinating legal advocacy and litigation to defend expressive rights across the country. He's a co-author of a course book on free speech fundamentals and has argued on behalf of civil liberties and numerous amicus briefs before the Supreme Court. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that Will is especially doing double duty today, testifying before Congress earlier today in the Senate Commerce Committee's hearing on jawboning, which hopefully many of us were able to attend and glean from there.
This conversation will be much better. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah.
Oh wait, Will, are you
Hopefully so.
muted? Am I off the hook? Am I off the hook, Will?
Yes, Ari, I think you're good.
Yeah, sorry, Ari. Sorry, everybody.
Well, great job today, Will.
And finally, I'm pleased to introduce my colleague from CDT, Alia Patia. Alia is a senior policy analyst on CDT's Free Expression Project, where she focuses on automated content moderation and multilingual AI. She recently co-authored a foundational report titled Lost in Translation that exposes the deep flaws in using large language models, or LLMs, for non-English content analysis. So now that you've met our panel, let's dive a little bit into the discussion. I'll direct an opening question to each of our panelists, but I encourage you all to build on each other's remarks as we go. I hope to structure this more as a free-flowing conversation rather than individual remarks. But that being said, Faisal, let's start with you to set the stage for us. Could you walk us through the recent history of government social media monitoring? How did this practice take hold in agencies like DHS and the State Department? And how has it evolved through the Trump and Biden administrations?
Sure. It might take a little while. Okay. So I usually trace, the sort of real burst of social media monitoring back to 2016, which is when the Obama administration first started gathering social media identifiers for people who were coming to the United States with visa waivers, right? This was then expanded in the Trump administration in two ways. Initially, as part of the Muslim ban executive order, they imposed additional social media vetting requirements and handle disclosure on some 65,000 people, mainly from Muslim countries. In 2018, they expanded this to collection of handles from all visa applicants, that's 15 million people a year, and they sought to expand it further to anybody applying for an immigration benefit. That's mostly people who are in the United States and might want an adjustment of status. You need a different kind of student visa, you need a green card, etc. That would affect about 33 million people a year. They did not eventually do that because by then the Biden administration had come into office, and the Biden administration's OIRA rejected that proposal on the grounds that they had not demonstrated a need for that information. At the same time, the Biden administration undertook a review of its social media monitoring programs. In the end, they didn't really do anything with the review. We haven't seen the results of that review, but nothing really changed in particular. You sort of fast forward to today, what you see is two things happen. Oh, wait, I need to mention one more thing. Sorry. But that doesn't mean that the Biden administration wasn't doing social media monitoring, because all of these things that I've talked about have all been in the immigration vetting context. But there is a part of the Department of Homeland Security, the Intelligence and Analysis Unit, whose basic purpose is, monitoring open source intelligence. And so they were definitely doing social media monitoring, and that included during the Trump years, it included anti-ICE protests, but during the Biden years, it was much broader. They included everything from the anti-vax truckers, you remember those who came to Washington during COVID, to people responding to the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And so, in just any sort of they had a really broad vision of what they were monitoring, so they called it threat narratives, which is a very flexible term. So they were already doing this. I don't think it was on a ginormous scale because the unit was relatively small. I think it was usually around 10 to 12 people during most of this time. Fast forward to the second Trump administration, and here we have, basically not only a massive increase in social media monitoring, but a massive increase in the types of speech they're monitoring, in the types of people they're monitoring, and in the kinds of tools that are being purchased, right? So initially, this was primarily an immigration tool, and the Trump administration has certainly used it as an immigration tool, and we've seen many instances of that, starting with in March 2025, when they announced the catch and revoke program, the theory of which was that they were going to monitor social media for terrorist, anti-Semitic, et cetera, in order to find them and revoke their visas. That was followed by several cables, which are a little bit vague and confusing, but generally seem to land up in a place where they're looking at the social media of people applying to go to educational institutes, either as students or scholars or teachers, and then also for people applying for immigration benefits. And they're vetting them according to the cables and the other information that has come out for like terrorism, but also for anti-Semitism and more broadly for anti-Americanism. So they're very, very fluid categories of speech that are being targeted. And this is both for people coming into the country as well as people applying for immigration benefits. But it's not stopping there, right? Because we've seen certainly both in the wake of the Charlie Kirk killing, where there have been, lots of indications that the government is, or at least some parts of the government are trying to track what people are saying online about Charlie Kirk. But also, I think, with the recent issuance of the Antifa executive order, as well as the National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, which defines domestic terrorism so broadly that it covers speech, fundraising, doxing, protest, all of these things are sort of part of this vast left-wing conspiracy that the administration is targeting. And I feel fairly sure that social media monitoring is kind of part of that targeting, especially since ICE has recently purchased additional social media monitoring tools, which has just been reported in the last few weeks.
Yeah, well, and I think there's about a million things in there that we could dedicate an entire panel to, right? All of the different ways that the federal administration is using social media monitoring to target all sorts of people. But I want to bring in Jennifer here to elaborate a little bit more about how you see social media monitoring being weaponized in immigration and some of the other contexts that Faisa just mentioned there. And would specifically invite you to comment on the First Amendment and due process concerns when the government attempts to use someone's online expression in any decision, whether that be about an immigration benefit or any other sort of benefit or any other sort of investigatory or prosecutorial action.
Thank you. And it's great to be here at the Future of Speech Online. This is always a kind of highlight, I feel, of the fall in tech policy space every year. And I thank Faisa for that excellent overview. I do want to kind of always start this conversation with my own limitations. I am not an immigration policy expert. We have some excellent immigration policy experts at Cato. So if we get into the specifics of underlying immigration law, I'm more than happy to point you to their work. And some of that has also touched on this subject. But as mentioned, I think this has been a growing concern and a growing concern amongst the public. This has been going on previously, but I think particularly over the last few years, we've seen an increasing public interest and concern about what this might mean for speech rights and what this might mean for the chilling effect, and not only for what it means for those who are immigrants or are touched by the immigration system, but what it also means for all Americans. So we have seen this kind of stepping up of social media monitoring for certain types of speech or for certain viewpoints that are considered problematic by an administration. And I think one of the concerns that has certainly been expressed in the last year or so is how much broader the interpretation of, for example, anti-American sentiment may be under the current element, that we're no longer talking about things that had been traditionally rather narrowly interpreted to be more direct response of support for terrorist groups, but things that might be views on the conflict in Gaza that disagree with the administration's position, criticism of the current administration, criticisms of different officials or of different events, and what that means for both those who are already here and may be concerned about the impact on their immigration status, but also what that just means in general for political dissent. One of the underlying concerns there is what that could mean for the impact on anonymous speech, both for political dissidents abroad who may be seeking safe refuge in the US and may have opinions on these pressing issues, as well as what it means for the average American user who may be engaged in discourse in this regard. And I think there have been concerns about how we could see social media monitoring expand to be potentially weaponized against Americans as well. And the First Amendment concerns that I'm sure will get much into depth of what's going on in the current litigation in some of these cases that we have seen brought up. But even if we were not to directly see a call to monitor American social media in the same regard, these kind of collections will inevitably impact all users. You are not going to be able to not impact Americans and Americans' data there. And so we certainly know that the free speech rights, the First Amendment rights of Americans will also be implicated in these kind of social media monitoring policies. In general, I think this does highlight what has been an increasing tension at times in the question of the potential friction between free speech and calls for strong national security. And while I believe probably most of us on this panel would say that the current interpretations of national security when it comes to social media monitoring are significantly broad, more generally, we've seen an increasing discourse around this potential trade-off and friction, whether it's in the TikTok divestiture ban or whether it's in this particular issue. What should be the standard that the government is held to when it claims that something is a national security risk, knowing that it's going to impact the speech rights of millions of Americans in the process? And I think this is just another example of where we are seeing that friction and where at times we are seeing a very broad definition of national security that can have quite significant impacts on our ability to engage in political discourse and on the speech rights of Americans, as well as of those who have come here through of American citizens, as well as those who are here through the immigration system at this time.
Well, and Will, I'll invite you here in a second to talk, especially just because Jennifer invoked some of your work there at FIRE, but maybe an open question to all of the panelists that I think is worth kind of acknowledging is this, framing as a national security interest, do you see it as a bit of a scapegoat or, a straw man for a much more difficult argument about what to actually do? And so the federal government promotes social media monitoring as a form to ensure national security, but is that really kind of hiding the ball about much more difficult conversations that need to be had about national security and about our free speech rights?
I mean, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, generally speaking, when the government invokes national security, it means you're going to have less transparency, you're going to have less process. And in my mind, you should have like a little bit of a raised eyebrow because it's such a broad fig leaf and has been historically used to basically hide all kinds of shameful things. So I think that's one thing. I also think it's also important to remember, just building on what Jennifer said is, one is it's not just the federal government that's doing social media monitoring. Police departments do it too. Schools do it. It's sort of across the board. And I don't think, schools have a national security mandate. They have a public safety, police departments have a national security mandate, they have a public safety mandate, which they have often exploited in order to use social media monitoring against activists, whether it's, Muslim Lives Matter in Boston or racial justice activists. I mean, this is like reported all the time. So I think that's also really troubling because national security is not the only thing here. I think the other piece of it that's really important to keep in mind is that there is an assumption that what you say is going to reflect or is a precursor, if you will, to some bad thing happening. And I just don't think that that relationship is established. And so I think it's really fundamental to push back on ideas of like dangerous speech, for example, or you know, anything that troubles an administration can be characterized as dangerous. And we see the results of it right now, right? I mean, everyone is like super aware of all of this, but like this isn't new, sorry to say. It's worse, it's more, but it isn't new.
Jennifer, did you want to add anything there?
No, I think that I was going to, but then Faiza ended up really nailing it in my opinion. Like I said, I do think this does go to the standard that we have to hold the government to when they claim national security as well. And particularly recognizing that kind of oftentimes once these claims of national security have been made, once we've started to allow this kind of monitoring for security or safety, it is very hard to get those rights back. It's very hard to put the genie back in the bottle once something has either become socially accepted as normal or just even legally allowed without challenge. And so that's why I think it's very important that when we do hear claims, whether it's for public safety or for national security, that we are ensuring that those high standards for review are being met in those regard.
And Will, I'd like to bring you in here then to kind of bring in your perspective as a First Amendment litigator. Can you expand on some of the practical impacts of this government monitoring on online discourse? And specifically also, how does the knowledge that the government may be or is watching your speech create a chilling effect for anyone who communicates online? And then also, I would love to hear kind of your insights on how you see litigation working to resist this suppressive force.
Yeah, sure. Tom, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here. Jennifer and Faiza have made excellent points. They've covered the waterfront in a very useful way, and I'm happy to jump in. Let me begin, if I may. Before FIRE was the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, we have the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. So Faiza's point about the long time nature of this kind of monitoring is really well taken and resonates with me. I remember early on the advent of Twitter, Yik Yak, various campus social media messaging platforms, back when we used to have to identify Facebook as Facebook.com, popular social media network, in our press releases. I remember that campuses that had significant sports programs, so your Big Ten, your SEC, big football program, basketball program campuses, were some early adopters of automated social media monitoring. And they were so clumsy then as to be kind of funny in a dark way. There were really broad categories, and they were kind of just keyword searches that would be run automatically on designated student athletes. And the words were really, again, very clumsy as being charitable words, like if one of your student athletes used the word gay or drunk or crash, they would be immediately flagged and sent to the head of the athletics department. So, God help you if your gay, cousin got in a car crash, but was hit by a drunk driver, right? You'd be at the front of the email. And it sounds silly, but we saw people begin to be investigated and even punished for their posts online. And looking back on it now, again, it's a humble beginning, but the pervasiveness of that kind of monitoring is spread exponentially. And I completely echo Faiza's points about the threat posed by ever-expanding definitions of what can be considered predicate speech offense. In other words, you can investigate as laid out in the National Security Presidential Memo. Completely echo Jennifer's excellent point about the normalization or the growing acceptance of social media monitoring, the fact that we are conditioned now to understand our words put online as being broadcast everywhere. There was that old joke. I guess I'm thinking a lot of gallows humor after that congressional hearing, but there's that old joke in left-wing activism circles from my time in undergrad. You'd meet and then you say, all right, which one of us is the Fed, right? Like who's it's old remnants of COINTELPRO or something that somebody would be there monitoring. That joke is not funny anymore. Craig Luciano, Fire's president, and I wrote a very, again, long time ago article in 2007 in the Boston Phoenix about making the point that with Facebook and that kind of social media conversation, so much is now visible to authority figures that we need to retrain our understanding of what people say online. Conversations that might have been whispered in the quad are now, on Main Street, so to speak. Unfortunately, instead of granting people either culturally a degree of grace or from a legal standpoint a degree of recognition of protected speech, we've gone in just the opposite direction. And the chill that now results with the expectation that everybody will be censored is real. And to switch, Tom, to your invitation, talk a little about what that means from a litigation perspective. It is extremely difficult to find people in this current moment, and I fear it will only get harder, who are willing to stand up and fight, because the chill is real and the threat is vivid and it's inarguable. I've been on conversations with potential plaintiffs who are here lawfully, non-citizen residents, happily employed, in some cases happily married, in some cases just purchased a home, and they are terrified about going against this administration, even proceeding under pseudonym. Just the challenges for finding individual plaintiffs is really difficult, and that's not in any way to cast any kind of aspersion on them. I understand it; it's a rational choice, but litigation really does require folks willing to fight, and right now the law feels uncertain and shifting, and optional to the administration. So we're in trouble. Just a quick note on that: we are representing the student newspaper, the Stanford Daily, and two non-citizens here in the country in our lawsuit challenging the provisions of the Immigration and Nationality Act that Secretary of State Rubio is invoking to justify the revocation and deportation of student activists like Rumeysa Ozturk, like Mahmoud Khalil, who are voicing pro-Palestinian views. So we are proceeding apace, and we're at an early stage. But yeah, again, there's so many different ways to take this conversation, but I will just say the situation seems to me particularly dire. And just to end on kind of a human note, if I may, I'm the father of two young children, an 8-year-old and 11-year-old, and included in my myriad instructions to them about the promise and peril of screens, I feel compelled to also tell them that folks are watching. That the world in which we live in now is a moderated one in many different respects, and the government is one of those watchers, those auditors. And when you couple that omnipresent visibility with an administration that really does not seem to have much care for the boundaries set by the First Amendment, you've got a very difficult situation indeed. And just as Jennifer says, with every invocation of national security that is granted credence by the Supreme Court on a very expedited briefing schedule, as in the TikTok case or in any, in a longer situation, you've got lasting harm that I fear will be very difficult to undo. I think we're going to be dealing with the fallout of this current moment for decades. So that's my cheery note, and I'm happy to talk more about it.
Will, I appreciate the cheery note, but I have to be honest that the chills that I got when you talk about describing the surveillance panopticon to your children is kind of the depressing note that really sticks with me. It's quite remarkable that that's a conversation that we have to have with small kids of beware that the government is always watching you. But I want to backtrack a little bit. I did also really appreciate the way that you described some of the tools historically as clumsy. But I think that we could argue that the tools today are still exceptionally clumsy. And so, Alia, I want to bring you into the conversation here. Your work has often focused on the technology itself and the ways that it is clumsy. Much of the social media monitoring, whether it's manual individuals reviewing the user's profile or automated based on an algorithm or new AI technologies. It's premised on this idea that Faisa also mentioned, that we can accurately interpret meaning, intent, or predisposition from content that you post online. So can you maybe speak a little bit to the technical and conceptual limits of these tools? And then especially talk about how does this work with non-English content, slang, political satire, and the like?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And it's super humbling to be part of this esteemed panel. I've learned so much from the panelists, so very cool to be amongst them. I think it's important to start by saying that these technologies don't work because the technology itself is flawed, as I'll go into, but also the underlying belief that technology can do this work is flawed and often premised on prejudicial assumptions of what type of speech or what type of conduct online sort of results into criminality. I'll speak to the first part, as I mentioned, but just to put a finer point on the latter, there's no technology that can predict criminality or future dangerous activity the way the State Department's Catch and Revoke initiative seeks to use or purports to want to use AI to deter criminal activity. Our analysis that you cited in Lost in Translation, which came out in 2023, which does a rights-based and a technical analysis of large language models, but also previous work published by CDT called Mixed Messages, which looked at other versions of sort of keyword matching tools and other machine learning models, have all found sort of sequentially that this type of content analysis technology can't do predictive analysis work and is very much bound by the data or the keywords that have trained the models. They're able to fundamentally act as pattern matchers and are at risk of reproducing the biases and the values that are encoded into the data they are trained on. And so that becomes really crucial to understand about the technology when it's deployed in context to apparently link certain traits, certain conduct, or certain speech to criminality or to wrongdoing that necessitates further immigration scrutiny or scrutiny of any kind. And I think anyone who's worked in the security and surveillance space or sort of has worked in, existed in this world knows that the belief that a certain person of a certain background or follows a certain page is more likely to commit crime is something that we've heard is prejudicial, and it doesn't work. So yes, to the next point, there's also a fundamental technical problem with building or procuring automated social media monitoring tools to vet immigrants and screen for things like anti-American values, precisely because you can't build technology to detect something you can't clearly define. I think, as my co-panelists have said, and I think a lot of literature has sort of written before, I think that's the goal. The goal is to sort of wield these amorphous views or amorphous terms to catch dissenting speech and catch those who, share dissent. But natural language processing tools or techniques that are used to build these social media monitoring tools require clear and consistent technical definitions and a specific property to build the tool itself. You need clear examples, you need a consensus around what anti-American views are, and it's not news to perhaps those who are listening to us that that doesn't exist in this case. You need examples of data that you need examples of keywords that fit under this definition of anti-American views and squarely fit outside that. And that sort of line drawing is very much open to the eye of the beholder in this context and is being used by actors who want to perhaps punish speech that goes against the administration's values. And also, I think not only are some of the terms that are being used to develop and design the training data sets for these systems, both capacious and undefined, but they're also, it seems like, a moving target, as evidenced by the recent detection and visa revocations of 6 individuals who tweeted or posted on X, Twitter, in glorification of the violence against Charlie Kirk. That was not immediately clear to be anti-American, when the anti-American EO came out, but now is. So that sort of moving target is also very interesting to note in terms of how these systems are being built. The sort of nexus in which these keywords come up or views or assumptions shape the development of these tools is sort of twofold in sort of keyword filtering tools and machine learning models. There will be a sort of set of annotated data that is clearly in violation of policy or deemed to be in violation of a policy to train the system to detect. In large language models that are commonly being used and sort of paraded as social, compliant with these EOs by companies like Palantir, Dataminr, Geophedia in the past, etc. What these models are already trained on a swath of speech and data available and freely accessible and scrapable off the web, and then a sort of developer or deployer of the technology. So either the vendor making it, or in the procurement process, there'll be a set of additional keywords collated and annotated as in violation of a policy, and then those new keywords will be used to fine tune a model and test the model. So again, to like sort of reinforce this worldview of the model. Many have written about this before, but the AI tools that'll be developed, these keywords are going to be, because the concepts that they're being used to map onto are amorphous, the keywords are going to be range in terms of views and points. In 2016, Faiza just referenced this, but there were social media monitoring tools used by law enforcement bodies to look for activists. The keywords they used to scan sort of protester activities were hashtags like "Don't Shoot" and "Black Lives Matter." And that could be shared by any number of individuals, citizens and non-citizens alike. That's expanding a vast dragnet of individuals who are going to be caught under the scrutiny. Many who were sharing it were engaging in First Amendment protected activities to protest and express themselves. But I think, this group can sort of speculate what the hashtags and keywords and phrases might be used in compliance with these EOs and these mandates to use social media monitoring. They could be anything from Gaza to President Trump, to Charlie Kirk, to any number of things. And those terms are going to be used for any number of reasons. They're going to be used in sharing a news article and sharing news in a Facebook group about what's happening in a particular region. They're going to be shared to both condemn or glorify certain activity. They're going to be used in tones like sarcasm, in engaging in sarcasm. A phrase, Will kind of talked a little bit about this with a great example. But most recently, a social media monitoring tool used in a school setting actually flagged an email that a teen sent her grandmother where she wrote, "I want to kill," in reference to a fly, and it was flagged for disciplinary action. That's an article that was reported in an article in the Washington Post by Daniel Wu. So we're seeing that these keywords are going to be used despite their sort of ubiquity online and the range of benign uses that they might engage in. Just for one, like, thought experiment, we could see a social media monitoring tool developed to detect anti-British sentiment during the American Revolution used keywords like Tea Party if they were trying to detect activism and acts of protest. It's sort of self-evident to this group how that might backfire, and a lot of, beautiful, wonderful, tasty tea parties might be caught into the mix. So I think it's important to sort of lay that out. These tools are searching for words regardless of the context. And then to your question of, how do these work in languages other than English? They really don't. And I think it's sort of a challenge at the technical level again. Our paper sort of dives into something called the resourcedness gap, where because the internet is predominantly available in English and populated by English language text, systems are trained more on English, even when they are sort of called as multilingual language models. And the few documents and resources that are used to train models in non-English language text come from government documents or machine translated speech. That's obviously not representative of how individuals are speaking online. What that means is that the errors that are already going to occur because of these systems, because of poor keyword matches or poor parsing of tone, sarcasm, things like that, are going to be amplified in these non-English language settings, further subjecting non-English language speaking immigrants and non-citizens to further scrutiny. They already face that offline, but more so by these tools. And we've already seen that in the use of automated translation tools that are similar in architecture used in humanitarian and border settings, where translations of birth certificates or translations have impeded people from seeking asylum because these tools misrepresented the reason someone was seeking asylum or the place where they were immigrating from. So there's a lot of, I'll stop now, but there's a lot of sort of areas where the technology is only going to amplify existing and reinforce existing burdens of the immigration system, and then also subject a lot to sort of deprivation of rights.
Can I jump in for a sec? I want to pick up on one thing that Alia said, where you talked about this being a moving target and the breadth of these definitions and who really knows what comes within them. But I kind of feel like that's the point, right? I mean, I feel like, the reason, we had this whole discourse about, oh, they designated Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. It's not even an organization, it's an ideology, et cetera, et cetera. And the same thing when we talk about anti-Americanism or, I don't know, there's all these catchphrases, right? Like the point is that it's so broad that anybody can be targeted under that, right? These things I mean, I can't say whether that's intentional or not, but it certainly seems to be that way, that like the idea is like everybody should be scared one way or the other.
If I may just jump in on that excellent point, I think it is the elasticity of it is a feature and not a bug. I'll give you a quick example. The quote unquote gender ideology executive order that was issued by this administration very early on, which broadly proclaimed there are two genders, et cetera. Right now, FIRE is in federal court litigating against the invocation of that expansive, proclamation by university officials in the state of Texas to ban drag shows. So, in other words, the executive order served as a kind of permission slip or a broad, yes, exactly, a broad hook upon which local officials could adapt it to their own personal preferences with regard to what dissenting speech or what disfavored speech they attack, and gives them cover to do so. So I think you're exactly right. I think the moving target aspect, which I again completely agree with Alia, is intentional and useful to the censor.
And I think what I hear then is that there's both objective failures of these types of monitoring and subjective failures. Alia demonstrates that objectively these tools don't work. And frankly, I really like the simplicity of Alia's answer that no, they just don't work. They have all sorts of failures. And then subjectively, we hear that they can be stretched in all sorts of ways. And Jennifer, I'd like to bring you in here for this a little bit on the subjective point, and especially as we get into constitutional context in the First Amendment here, how do you possibly distinguish between constitutionally protected but controversial speech, say criticism of U.S. foreign policy, and a genuine security threat? And then with this too, as these tools are stretched, what resources do individuals have to kind of push back against the suppression of their speech?
We've traditionally had a very high standard for clear threats, incitement to violence, those type of speech that would be considered unlawful speech. I think one of the concerns is how broadly viewpoint issues could come into play here, and the potential of once you give the government the opportunity to be the arbiter of truth or the arbiter of some of these more amorphous terms, how that could be potentially weaponized to require platforms to shut down dissent, whether it's dissent over debates around the COVID-19 pandemic, or whether it's dissent around certain political issues of the day. Certainly the concerns about kind of government censorship by proxy can intertwine with this issue as well. And so I think that's one of the key concerns is not only what does that message does that send here in the US, but also what message does that send to other countries? If we think of the US as kind of the exemplar of a free society, the kind of First Amendment as this gold standard of free expression that goes so much farther than what we see even in places like Europe, where here in the US we have a very high standard for when the government can intervene in speech at all. If we start to slip away, not only what message does that send here at home, but what message does that send to our allies, and perhaps even more concerningly, our adversaries, people that we know would love to use social media monitoring tools to shut down dissent, to identify political dissidents in totalitarian regimes, to really go after those people who are putting their lives on the line by speaking out in some cases.
Yeah, and I'd invite all the other panelists to share their thoughts on this. To the extent that you track this issue internationally, how does our domestic surveillance practices influence international surveillance norms, and how have international surveillance norms or other regimes influenced our systems? And what are the particular concerns that you all have about this?
I don't track it particularly, but I know that we were looking at this issue of using social media for visa vetting to see whether, other NATO countries or European countries were doing that kind of vetting. And the best we could figure out was they weren't. I mean, certainly you hear about, social media vetting of dissent and human rights defenders and the stuff in many countries. But I wouldn't know the specifics of it. I think one thing though, I don't know if can I go somewhere else? Tom? Okay.
Of course.
One thing, though, I think that is, I think, quite interesting about the moment we're in now is that when you talk about social media surveillance and you talk about, you're like, look, DHS is monitoring these COVID-19 protesters and these people who are upset about what happened to Roe versus Wade. You very rarely have a clear action that follows from the social media surveillance. And I think that's what's changed in the current context for a couple of reasons. One is that this administration is pretty clear about what it wants to do and what it's going to do. It's not hiding the ball. It's not saying, oh, I mean, it's literally just saying that in executive orders and even more in statements from senior administration officials. So it's no secret that they plan to use the social media to take actions against people, right? And that's been true initially in the immigration space. And I think with the issuance of the domestic terrorism orders, I think we're going to start to see them pushing the boundary on between speech and, between protected speech and protected organizing and what they would view as domestic terrorism. And it'll be really interesting to see how those cases turn out, because if you go back and you look at the international terrorism case law, right? Those cases also involved this line between speech and, material support for terrorism, a much more loose and prosecution-friendly regime for sure. But if you look at, there were cases where somebody, translated an Al-Qaeda tract, and that was found to be enough, to warrant a charge that was upheld. So it's just, I come at it from that perspective because national security is sort of like the counterterrorism piece is where I started my career. And I'm just kind of curious as to how you see this particular debate will play out in these cases. And these cases will come because they will bring prosecutions that will push the envelope on this issue. That seems to me pretty certain.
Yeah, do any of other panelists have thoughts on this? I think the example that really comes to mind is obviously the crackdown on pro-Palestinian speech that we see at this moment. And I hear Faisa's point that could this moment be seized for one issue and brought into the next in the future, and kind of where could this all be headed? Will, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in quickly and just echo Faiza's excellent point. It's much like the elasticity, the useful elasticity of the executive order, the broadening, the normalization that Jennifer spoke of earlier. Once folks are conditioned to expect that kind of, we're doing this, we're marching down Main Street, this is what we're going to do. Look out, see if you can stop us in the courts. Then there's I think, a lasting harm, a lasting impact. I will also say that if I think somebody said at the hearing this morning, if hypocrisy was famously said is the tribute that vice pays to virtue, if there's no hypocrisy, if it's just willing ownership, and even advertising in some instances, given what we've seen out of some of the social media accounts run by the administration, a boastfulness and almost gleefulness in that kind of straightforward, you can't say that, we're coming after you. I remember that early on in the administration, that graphic from Department of Homeland Security that listed ideas as contraband that might need to be checked at the border. Once that's gone, it's awful. And I'm 44. I'm old enough to understand that a certain cynicism about in America's place in the world is warranted. My mother was from New Zealand. I've got relatives in England and New Zealand. I'm always aware that the story we tell ourselves about the beacon of freedom upon the hill is not always the story that others see. But I will say that that image, to the extent that it had credibility, it feels irrevocably tarnished. To lecture other countries on commitments to free expression, rightfully so, I think, in many instances. Some of the abuses, thinking pro-Palestinian speakers, some of the abuses that we're seeing in England right now are horrifying, with speakers being arrested for speech online. But no longer, I think, do I feel at all confident in claiming a mantle of, as Jennifer put it before, if this is the gold standard. If it's optional, if it's ignored in practice, if it's meaningless, then what good is it? So, yeah, I think the just as FISA says, the cases will come. There will be an expansive, a gaping maw into which speech will be delivered. That is domestic terrorism, and look out. We've got a lot of time left in this administration and a lot of court battles yet to come.
Mhm. Yeah, Will, you invoked that post. I think it was either from ICE or CBP that talked about the spread of ideas across the borders. And I just always think about the irony of it, that out of one side of their mouth, they're talking about how if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. And yet they post something about what could be argued as unconstitutional action, and then they immediately take it down based on backlash as if they have something to hide about what they're doing, being that their actions are unconstitutional. And I think it also, reflects how the administration often misunderstands the nature of privacy and the purpose of free expression. And I think that gets to your broader point there about whether or not we can truly be kind of the beacon of free speech here in the United States. But maybe building off of that, I'd like to also hear all of your thoughts about, we've talked a lot about free speech here, but how is freedom of association and our other civil rights implicated in all of this? Because it's not just individual users that are suppressed, but it's the community as a whole.
Well, I'll jump in very quickly. I mean, one of the plaintiffs in our lawsuit against Secretary Rubio is the Stanford Daily, and they're advancing. We are advancing an organizational standing theory on the point that they are harmed when writers no longer feel comfortable voicing views about Israel and Palestine, and that they no longer will be able to have those views in their pages authored by non-citizens here in the United States, and that's a harm. And that's just one example. I mean, we can talk about the threats seemingly authorized by that national security presidential memo to look into. I think as FISA called it, the vast left-wing network, right? I mean, I'm sure folks on this call have talked to other groups that fear the consequences, whether that's revocation of tax status or worse, for taking lines against the administration.
And if I could just hop on something that Will said, I think we oftentimes think about this in this current moment as targeting left-wing groups or targeting left-wing activists or whatever. But it's very important to remember that if this power is allowed to stand, it doesn't just stay on one side of the aisle. And so particularly for those on the right who might, be seeing right now and saying, well, they're doing the right thing, they're going after the right speech or whatever. Remember how quickly we have seen changes in opinion. We've seen changes in which party holds control of this power. Would you want the person you most disagree with on a very deeply personal, philosophical, political issue to be the one who gets to decide which viewpoints get expressed? And that should really be the standard that we hold this kind of power to. That we're really only, that if it is to be invoked at all, we are looking at direct calls to violence type of situations, not the kind of broader discourse. And to the point on association, I think that goes back to something I was alluding to in my original opening. And again, the importance of not thinking of, well, this doesn't impact me, I'm an American citizen, why should I care about the impact on someone's speech rights if they're coming here under the immigration policies, it goes back to that very association element, to the fact that this will chill broader conversations. And even if you're the one with the non-controversial view, if you believe in the marketplace of ideas, and if you believe in the importance of engaging in discourse, it chills both sides of the discourse, not just one side, because you otherwise are going to have these conversations in a complete vacuum where you lose the importance that comes from having those conversations and grappling with difficult ideas with one another.
Can I just add something to that? Because I think that's a really great point. And I think on the association point, right, we have to remember how important social media is for organizing, right? I mean, it is the primary tool that people use for organizing. And so you're going to affect that. The second point I want to make is that when you look at social media monitoring, like they don't just monitor you, they monitor your entire circle. Right. And it's very explicit if you look at sort of recent contracting documents and all, which is that we may want you to, monitor our friends and associates. They're doing what they call network analysis. They want to know everything about everybody around you, which means that inevitably, like a lot of people are going to get caught up in the net. I want to flag two other things too as well for the group, as I love to hear what people think. One of the many cables on visa vetting required everybody to put their social media chats off private, which meant that everything, like they couldn't have like a private conversation or post that went only to a few people. Everything on their social media had to be public. And I think that this was in the immigration context where you're applying for a visa. So I think you're probably looking at limited rights to challenge something like that. But if that jumps over into more domestic contexts, such as immigration benefits or other kinds of social media, I don't know how that exactly would happen. I mean, there you've got a very clear Fourth Amendment issue over there, I think. I think that's super important thing to kind of keep track of.
Mhm.
And there was something else, but I forget.
Oh, yeah. Did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think the mentions and invocations of AI in these like calls to use social media monitoring have been quite intentional in in sort of fortifying the threat to speech and or at least making clear that the goal is to chill expression and participation broadly. I think a lot of us who've been working in this field have been trying to look for examples where social media monitoring tools have led to a specific visa revocation or a specific detention of an individual. And obviously, if that's happened, it's quite hard to sort of identify directly. But it might be the case, at least in AUP v. Rubio, the judge's sort of writing, all of the interviews with directors of and associate directors of various immigration agencies suggested that it was sort of still manual social media monitoring that was being employed. But I guess I want to say that the invocation of AI is as important as the use of AI, because I think what they're trying to assert is they're trying to rest on some of the sort of like narratives and beliefs of the omnipresence of AI. I think people sort of think of AI now as this like, first of all, one specific technology rather than a range of technologies and techniques. There's a sort of a lot of obfuscation of what's actually being done, how it's being done, et cetera, by the companies, by governments, by third-party actors who are actually detecting individual speech and then reporting them to the government. But, in addition, I think a lot of individuals, including non-citizens and citizens, are thinking that, are seeing AI tools being rapidly integrated and believe them to be omnipresent. So I think the goal is to chill participation on almost every surface of your life because you could always be watched. So it's, I think that was really intentional. And, in the most recent United Auto Workers v. State Department lawsuit, they did a poll of United Auto Workers members, and 60% of them said that they had changed their online activity. They had, changed their online activity, not posted certain things, and sort of like decided to unfollow certain accounts, etc. So I think the impacts are broader than just expression online, but also participation offline in protests. participation in terms of like just associational rights. And then also want to highlight the sort of impact on academic freedom, because a lot of non-citizens are also professors and contributing in other ways. Evelyn Dueck, who's like a member of the FOSO and free speech community broadly, wrote in The Atlantic a piece called "Can I Teach the First Amendment If I Have a Green Card?" So what does that sort of chilling of academic contributions also mean for sort of the broader marketplace of ideas? I was really compelled by Alistair Kitchen, who did the lightning talk right before us. Also, his sort of one of the outcomes he highlights as a potential homogeneity of speech as well.
Will, I saw you chomping at the bit almost, it looked like there. Did you want to
I
jump
just
in?
I want to say, hell yeah, that's exactly right to most of it. Yeah, no, there's so much again to jump in on. I think the point, Ali, that you made about kind of projecting power, almost this Wizard of Oz, he sees you when you sleep and sees you when you're awake kind of point, is really excellent. Your point about the fact that it's still clumsy. There's
Right.
an interest in making it out to be the panopticon is really well taken, because I absolutely have found myself thinking, I remember we visited my relatives in England this summer. And I'm coming back. I know my rights as much as anybody I think might reasonably expect one to know them. And I'm entering and I'm thinking, I wonder, and that is exactly what I think the government would like, is for me to be thinking, I wonder. So your point is very well taken.
And just on that, I mean, I don't know whether you guys have seen this, but like in terms of international travel, like all of like the nonprofits and civil society groups that I know, academics, even like my sister-in-law is like, should I wipe my phone? And I'm
Right.
like, yeah, you should. I'm like, yeah, you
It's
should.
discomforting not to be able to say, no, like I
But
hear
but I won't say that, right?
right. And it would be unreasonable for you to say that. It's more rational for you to say what you said. That's right.
One other player that's involved in all of this that I don't think we've touched on too much here are the third-party social media companies and data brokers and analytic firms that are responsible for often creating the surveillance tools in the first place, or aggregating data and interpreting it for the government. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on the responsibility of the private sector enabling this surveillance? And then what accountability mechanisms, if any, should we have in place for companies that profit from these technologies?
I think we should have a comprehensive data privacy law that prevents them from doing this kind of data collection, and it shouldn't have a carve out for law enforcement or national security.
So
I
I was
love that,
also
Faiza. I
I
love
was
that.
also going to talk about data privacy, but I was actually going to talk about how, I think one of the concerns is when we talk about data privacy, we're so often talking about consumer privacy, and we aren't necessarily talking about what, if any, legal frameworks are needed when it comes to this more traditional privacy from the government, Fourth Amendment privacy type of rights that could provide clarity for both consumers, for these third-party companies, and honestly for law enforcement themselves that may be wanting to do things the right way, so that if they are trying to gather information in a legitimate case, that they know that evidence can stand up in court. Because one of the things we haven't talked about here is, how the Fourth Amendment can come into play with even how some of this evidence is gathered and what that can mean if you do get to a place where you actually have a potential case. And I think around those, it's providing clarity about when and how this can be accessed, so that if companies just get a request from the government of allow us to access all your data, they know whether or not they have to comply with that. They know whether or not they can say, come back with a warrant. They know if they make certain promises to their consumers about what they will and won't comply with, that they're able to reasonably keep those promises as much as any corporation could in that kind of situation. And as I said, I think that also then can even benefit the relationship between citizens and government, or citizens and law enforcement, by knowing what those standards are and ensuring that rights are protected in that way. So when we think about things like the third party doctrine, when we think about some of the kind of workarounds of government potentially using data brokers rather than going about other ways to get access to data, I think this is some of the conversation that we should be having, whether it's along with the social media monitoring conversation, or if it's part of a broader privacy conversation, particularly as we enter the age of AI. But there will be incredibly beneficial uses of AI, including by government agencies, but there will also be incredibly real concerns about the potential impacts on civil liberty.
And on that note of kind of looking forward where this conversation needs to go, I want to start kind of concluding this panel a little bit. But I have one more question that I'm going to frame and invite each of you to answer in turn if you would like. Being mindful of time, we have about 4 to 5 minutes left, so about 1 minute for each of you to try to conclude your thoughts here. But if you could propose one concrete step, whether it's a policy change, a legal challenge, or a new technical safeguard, what would be the single most important thing that we could do to mitigate the harms of social media monitoring and protect online speech?
I'll take a first cut. Maybe some, I really like Jennifer's last point, but maybe some platforms with backbone.
I really think that some kind of like serious audit of the benefits of social media would really move the needle on this conversation. I wanted to say ban social media monitoring except in certain limited circumstances, like where you have a predicated investigation or a demonstrated public safety need. But that seems kind of, that's not going to happen anytime soon. But I think what could happen is like if we could like, if there should be some serious consideration of what the benefits are of this. I remember this, I won't take too long. The Knight Foundation did this FOIA request for the social media monitoring of and the collection of identifiers, right? And they found these documents where, the DNI was like, well, it's not actually helping us in vetting, but we kind of want to keep the information anyway. And so I think like, there's a needle there that I think could be moved because there's this assumption that it works. And I think we really kind of be helpful to test that assumption.
I will kind of reiterate a couple of things that I've said. I think one is particularly providing those clear guardrails for civil liberties, making sure that it is understood by both individuals what their rights are when it comes to these type of issues, as Will was kind of talking about, both in terms of those who may be actually challenging these, but also just everyday citizens of knowing what's going on, knowing what if someone asks to see your social media profile, that means whether or not you have to grant that kind of access. And then I think, and then providing clarity to companies around handing over this data or various elements like that, I think is going to be critically important as well. But then the other point I want to reiterate is why we should all think about how this matters for us. This is not just well, I have nothing to hide, therefore I don't care. Again, the precedents this set and what this may mean for future of speech, for the future of the way that we're able to engage in discourse, particularly with those that we may disagree with, what it means for everyone and their speech rights, I think should certainly be top of mind, and not just thinking that this doesn't particularly apply to me, why should I care? Because it will ultimately impact your speech rights as well.
Yeah, I think everything has been said already. I'll just add to say, I think we need more honest disclosure from companies about what their tools can and cannot do. That seems like another pipe dream just because of like a current AI hype cycle. But I think, clarity on what sort of keyword matching and large language models can do in content analysis settings would be helpful.
And their training data, Alia.
And their training data, yeah.
Maybe before I bring us home, is there any final thoughts, anything that we missed in the conversation that must be said?
So I think the only thing I didn't necessarily say, and it's a little separate from this conversation, but we have to remember that tools developed for the good guys don't stay only for the quote unquote good guys. If you create an encryption backdoor, if you create a social media monitoring tool for the good guys, that can just as easily be abused by the bad guys, by nefarious actors, whether it's adversarial governments or whether it is bad actors seeking to just gather information to do nefarious things like fraud or other bad acts. And so that's certainly something else to remember.
And if I can just add one small point, which is that we haven't really talked about privacy, right? So at the end of the day, if the government is sweeping up all these social media posts, they actually have this giant repository of what people say and what they believe and where they're going. And that's just going to stay there forever. I mean, government records almost rarely get, purged, and they're shared pretty easily. So I think we also have to think about what is this sort of broader term risk of having this pool of information.
Alia, Will, any final thoughts?
Got too many, but I'll just say it's been an honor. And thank you for talking. To Faiza's last point, it reminds me of points we made in the age verification litigation, right? Every time you have to show your government the ID, where's that going? And to Jennifer's excellent point, who could control, who could access that data? But yes, I echo the concerns here and grateful for the chance to participate.
Well, thank you all. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Alia.
No, I was just going to say thank you and great to be on this panel.
And as frustrating as it is to be in these times, I want to say I feel invigorated through this conversation and excited to keep the fight up. And I want to extend a huge thank you to our incredible panelists, Faiza Patel, Jennifer Huddleston, Will Creeley, and Ali Fatia for sharing your invaluable expertise with us today. And thank you to everyone in the audience for your engagement. I'm going to pass it back to Kate from CDT for closing remarks.
Hey, thanks, Tom. I am going to keep it brief. Thank you to Tom Bowman, Jennifer, Faiza, Alia, and Will for a fascinating and excellent conversation. And thanks to everyone again for joining us for the Future Speech Online 2025, hosted by CDT and Stand Together Trust. As a reminder, these sessions were recorded and will remain available on YouTube. So if you missed anything, you can go back and see it again. And we will see you next year. Thank you so much, everyone.